At my engagement dinner, my future mother-in-law looked our waiter up and down and pointed a manicured finger at me. She does government administrative work, so she will have whatever is cheapest. A plate of plain pasta is fine. My own housekeepers eat better than that, but we are on a budget. I sat in silence while my fiancé nodded in agreement. Halfway through the meal, the restaurant owner rushed to our table flanked by 3 federal security agents. He bypassed my future-in-laws, entirely bowing slightly as he reached my chair. "Madam Ambassador," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet dining room. "Your diplomatic table with the secretary is ready." The solid silver fork slipped from my future mother-in-law's hand and hit her porcelain plate with a sharp crack. "I am Chloe. I am 31 years old." What happened after that fork hit the plate tore down an entire Manhattan real estate dynasty. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their empire piece by piece, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe respect should never have a price tag. Now let us rewind to the beginning of that dinner at Le Bernardin. It is the kind of New York restaurant where the lighting is dim and reservations take months to secure. I wore a simple black dress from Zara. My fiancé, Julian Sterling, wore a bespoke Italian suit. His mother, Beatrice, sat across from us. She wore a diamond necklace that caught the candlelight every time she moved her hands. The waiter handed out the leather-bound menus. Beatrice reached across the table and snatched mine right out of my hands. She handed it back to the waiter. "She will not need this," Beatrice said. Her tone was casual, as if discussing the weather. "Chloe works a little government job. Her salary barely covers her rent in Queens. Bring her some plain noodles. My maid actually has a more refined palate, but Chloe needs to learn her place in the Sterling family hierarchy." I turned to Julian, the man I was supposed to marry in 3 months. He was swirling a glass of Cabernet. He took a slow sip, set the glass down, and gave me a patronizing smile. "Mom makes a fair point, Chloe. We really need to tighten our belts. That country club deposit for the wedding reception is due next week. Every dollar counts." I looked at the man I had shared an apartment with for 2 years. The man who thought my daily subway commute and modest wardrobe meant I was struggling to survive. I kept my face blank. I did not argue. I let the waiters bring me a plate of plain pasta while the Sterlings ordered caviar oysters and imported Wagyu beef. They drank vintage champagne. I drank tap water. 2 hours later, the leather check presenter arrived. The total was $4,000. Beatrice picked it up, inspected the numbers, and slid it across the white linen tablecloth until it stopped right in front of my plate. "You are paying this," she stated. It was not a question. It was a command. "Julian and I have discussed it. If you want to marry into our family, you need to prove you can contribute. Consider this your initiation fee." I placed my napkin on the table. "I am not paying a $4,000 bill for food I did not eat, Beatrice." The air around the table turned to ice. Beatrice leaned forward, her face twisted into a sneer. "You insolent little girl. You crawl out of whatever middle-class hole you grew up in, trick my son into a proposal, and now you refuse to pay your dues." Julian sighed heavily. He reached his hand across the table, aiming straight for my purse. "Just give me your credit card, Chloe. Stop embarrassing us in front of these people." His fingers were inches from my bag when the main doors of the private dining area swung open. The general manager of the restaurant walked in. Behind him were 3 men wearing earpieces and dark suits. The chatter in the room faded into silence. They walked past the hedge fund managers and real estate tycoons. They stopped directly at our table. Beatrice sat up straight. She fixed her hair, assuming they were coming to greet the wealthy Sterlings. Instead, the manager looked at me and bowed. "Madam Ambassador, your diplomatic table with the Secretary of State is prepared." Beatrice stared at me, her face drained of color. Julian pulled his hand back from my purse as if it had caught fire. The clatter of the solid silver fork striking fine porcelain echoed like a gunshot in the hushed dining room. Beatrice Sterling sat frozen. Her mouth hung open slightly, ruining her carefully curated socialite posture. The condescending smirk had vanished, replaced by a pale, breathless mask of shock. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I maintained the exact same posture I had held for the last 2 hours. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my simple leather clutch. I bypassed the diplomatic credentials tucked in the side pocket and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. I placed it neatly under my water glass. "This should cover the plain pasta, Beatrice," I said. The tone of my voice was flat and steady. "Keep the change. Perhaps you can use it toward that country club deposit." I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my unbranded black dress. The general manager and the 3 federal security agents immediately parted, creating a clear path for me. I did not look back at the table. I did not look at Julian. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the polished hardwood floor. The heavy atmosphere of the restaurant seemed to part around me. I was halfway across the grand lobby when the frantic sound of leather dress shoes slapping against the marble floor echoed behind me. "Chloe, wait. Stop walking right now." It was Julian. I paused near the revolving glass doors, turning slowly to face the man I had shared a life with for 24 months. He was breathing heavily, a stark contrast to his usual composed, arrogant demeanor. His designer tie was slightly askew, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. There was no regret in them. There was no guilt for allowing his mother to humiliate me. Instead, his pupils were dilated with a manic, feverish intensity. He looked like a gambler who had just realized he was holding the winning ticket. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking as he thrust the screen toward me. He had clearly done a rapid search the second I walked away. "You are the Special Trade Ambassador for the United Nations?" He gasped the words tumbling out of his mouth in a rush. "You are the Chief Director of the Global Foreign Direct Investment Initiative. You manage a $5 billion government fund." I remained silent, letting his sudden realization hang in the cold air of the lobby. Julian took a step closer, his voice rising in pitch. 2 years, Chloe. For 2 years you drove a beaten-up Honda Civic to our dates. You wore off the rack clothes from Zara. You let me pay for your coffee because I thought your administrative salary barely covered your rent. Why would you hide this? My security detail shifted seamlessly, positioning themselves a few feet away, close enough to intervene, but far enough to let me handle my personal affairs. "I hid it for security protocols, Julian," I replied evenly. "And because I needed to know who you were when you thought I had nothing to offer you but myself. Tonight you and your mother gave me a very clear answer. I expected him to backpedal. I expected him to grovel or blame his mother for the brutal display at the dinner table. But the logic of a Manhattan finance bro operates on a different frequency. The realization of my wealth and political power had short-circuited whatever shred of decency he possessed. The humiliation he had subjected me to minutes ago was already erased from his mind, replaced entirely by unadulterated greed. "Okay, fine," Julian said, waving his hand dismissively as if waving away a minor inconvenience. "Mom was out of line. She has old-fashioned views. We can fix that later. Do you understand what this means for us? This changes everything." "It changes nothing," I said, turning back toward the revolving doors. "The wedding is off. Do not contact me again." I took one step before his hand shot out. His fingers clamped around my wrist with bruising force. The grip was tight, desperate, and possessive. Agent Davis, the lead security officer, immediately took a swift step forward, his hand hovering near his jacket lapel. I raised my free hand just an inch, signaling the agent to hold. I wanted to hear exactly what Julian was about to say. "You are not walking away from me," Julian hissed. His handsome face distorted into an ugly, entitled grimace. "You owe me for wasting 2 years of my time playing a poor girl. My father is drowning in debt. The Sterling Real Estate Group is on the verge of filing for bankruptcy by the end of this quarter." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of the expensive Cabernet I was not allowed to drink. "You control $5 billion in foreign investment capital. You have the diplomatic authority to approve international bailouts and allocate government contracts. You are going to sign a federal relief package for my father tomorrow morning." I stared at the white knuckles gripping my wrist. The sheer audacity of his demand was staggering. He was not asking for a favor. He was issuing a threat, fully believing that our engagement gave him a legitimate claim over federal resources. "Let go of my arm," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Consider it your wedding gift to the family," he pressed on, ignoring my warning. "You sign the contract, save the company, and I will make sure my mother treats you with the respect you deserve. We can still get married. We can be a power couple. Just transfer the funds." I twisted my arm sharply, breaking his grip with a practiced martial arts maneuver my security team had taught me. Julian stumbled forward, caught off guard by the physical pushback. "You do not want a wife, Julian. You want a corporate bailout," I said, stepping backward toward the glass doors. "Your father built a fraudulent empire, and it is going to collapse exactly the way it is supposed to. I will not compromise international trade funds to save a family that calls me the help." Agent Davis stepped smoothly between us, his broad shoulders forming an impenetrable wall. "Sir, take a step back," the agent commanded. Julian glared at me over the agent's shoulder. His chest heaved with rage. "You think you can just walk away from a Sterling. You have no idea what my family can do. You better watch your back, Chloe." I turned my back on him and walked through the revolving doors into the cool New York night air. A black armored SUV with diplomatic license plates was idling at the curb. The rear door was held open for me. I slid into the leather seat, the heavy door slamming shut and sealing away the noise of the city. "Take me to the safe house," I instructed the driver. The vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving Le Bernardin and Julian Sterling behind. I leaned my head against the tinted window, watching the city lights blur past. My pulse was steady. I had spent 2 years building a life with a man who viewed my fabricated poverty as a flaw to be tolerated and my actual power as an asset to be exploited. I opened my purse to retrieve my secondary encrypted phone. I needed to notify the United Nations Security Council that my cover had been blown to a civilian. As I powered on the device, my personal civilian phone buzzed from the bottom of my bag. It was a high-priority alert from Chase Bank. I pulled out the personal phone and unlocked the screen. The notification glowed brightly against the dark interior of the SUV. Alert. A withdrawal of $150,000 has been processed from your joint checking account. Current balance is $0. I stared at the screen. The joint account was the fund we had set up exclusively for wedding expenses. I had deposited my hard-earned civilian savings into it. Julian had insisted on having joint access to manage the vendor payments. He had not wasted a single second. The moment I walked out of that restaurant while he was chasing me down the lobby, demanding a federal bailout, he had already initiated a wire transfer on his phone, draining every last cent from our shared account. He did not just try to leverage my political power. He had actively robbed my personal savings in an act of petty malicious retaliation. I tapped the screen, opening the transaction details. The money had not gone to a wedding vendor. It had been wired to an offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, a holding company associated with Sterling Real Estate Group. I was trying to plug the holes in his sinking ship with my money. I did not panic. I did not cry over the stolen funds. Instead, a cold, calculated clarity washed over me. Julian thought he was dealing with a vulnerable woman he could financially abuse and cast aside. He had no idea how a global trade ambassador dismantles a financial threat. I dialed a secured number. My chief of staff answered on the first ring. "Cancel all my morning meetings," I ordered, staring at the zero balance on my screen. "I need a full forensic audit on the Sterling Real Estate Group by sunrise. We are going hunting." The morning sunlight filtered through the bulletproof glass of my Manhattan office. It was 6 o'clock. I sat behind a polished mahogany desk. The quiet hum of the United Nations secure servers provided the only background noise in the suite. My fingers moved rapidly across the encrypted keyboard. I bypassed the standard customer service protocols of the bank and routed my request directly to the Federal Financial Fraud Division. Within 10 minutes, I placed a hard freeze on the joint checking account Julian had drained. I also initiated a wire recall protocol. The money was already gone, but the digital footprint remained. I needed to see exactly where my personal savings had landed. A sharp knock interrupted my focus. Agent Davis opened the heavy double doors of my suite. He did not look alarmed, but his stance was rigid and alert. "Madam Ambassador, we have a visitor," Davis announced. He bypassed the downstairs screening checkpoints using a Level 4 federal clearance badge. A tall man stepped into the room. He wore a charcoal gray bespoke suit that fit his athletic frame flawlessly. It was Marcus. He was the brother-in-law to Julian, a senior partner at a top-tier corporate law firm and the only person in the Sterling family who had actually earned his wealth. Marcus was an African-American man who had married Vivian, the sister of my former fiancé, 5 years ago. At family gatherings, the Sterlings paraded him around to prove how modern and progressive they were. Yet I had noticed the subtle condescension. I had watched Richard Sterling hand Marcus empty cocktail glasses to dispose of pretending he mistook his highly educated son-in-law for the catering staff. Marcus closed the door behind him. He did not offer a polite greeting. He walked straight to my desk and dropped a thick manila folder onto the polished wood surface. "I see you are busy tracing the wire transfer," Marcus said. His voice was deep and devoid of any familial warmth. "Save your time. I already have the routing numbers." I leaned back in my leather chair, studying his expression. "How did you get past federal security, Marcus?" He pulled a laminated badge from his breast pocket and tossed it onto the desk next to the folder. "Department of Justice Consulting Liaison," he replied. "The Sterlings think I just review their commercial real estate contracts. They do not know I also consult for the Financial Crimes Task Force. And right now, my father-in-law is about to trigger a federal indictment." I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Have a seat. Why are you bringing this evidence to me? You are married to his daughter." Marcus let out a dry, bitter laugh. He sank into the leather chair, loosening his silk tie with a weary pull. "They treat me like trash, Chloe. They smile for the cameras at the country club galas, but behind closed doors, I am just the hired help who happens to sleep with Vivian. They tolerate my presence because my legal expertise keeps Richard out of a prison cell. They think I am blind to their microaggressions. They think I should be grateful they let me sit at their dinner table." He leaned forward, placing both hands on my desk. "They view you exactly the same way. You are a tool to them, an asset to be drained, and Julian is the worst of them all." I opened the manila folder. Pages of bank statements and offshore routing codes stared back at me. "What is this?" I asked, skimming the highlighted figures. "That is your stolen $150,000, Marcus stated plainly. "Julian wired it at 9 o'clock last night. It did not go to a wedding vendor. It went straight to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands." I traced the line of data with my index finger. Why would a supposedly wealthy real estate heir need to steal savings to fund an offshore account? "Because the Sterling Real Estate Group is a mirage," Marcus said. "Richard Sterling has been running a Ponzi scheme for the last 4 years. He takes deposits for luxury condominium developments that do not exist and uses the new money to pay off the old investors." The market shifted. The new investments dried up. They are drowning. They needed immediate liquidity to pay off a silent partner who was threatening to break their kneecaps. "Julian stole your money to buy them a few more days of breathing room." I absorbed the information. The arrogance at dinner, the demand that I pay the bill, the refusal to treat me with basic human decency. It was a calculated performance by people who were secretly bankrupt. I looked up at Marcus. "Julian found out my true identity last night at the restaurant. He demanded I approve a federal bailout for his father." Marcus shook his head slowly. A grim expression settled over his features. "He lied to you, Chloe. Julian did not find out last night. He has known you are the special trade ambassador for a full month." The words hung in the quiet office. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. "Explain," I commanded. 30 days ago, Julian hired a private investigator to look into your background," Marcus explained. "He was looking for hidden debt. Instead, the investigator uncovered your diplomatic immunity and your oversight of the Global Foreign Direct Investment Initiative. He found out you control a $5 billion government fund." My mind raced. If he knew I was an influential political figure for an entire month, why did he continue to treat me like an impoverished administrative assistant? Why did Beatrice demand I eat the cheapest meal on the menu? "It was a psychological strategy," Marcus said, answering my unspoken question. "Julian knows how to read people. He knew that if he suddenly started treating you like royalty, you would put up walls. Instead, he and Beatrice orchestrated a campaign of emotional suppression." Marcus pointed to the folder on the desk. "The dinner last night was a setup. They wanted to break your confidence. They wanted to humiliate you, make you feel small, make you feel like you owed them for the privilege of marrying into their family. The plan was to destroy your self-esteem so that when they finally asked for the government bailout, you would be so desperate for their validation that you would sign the papers without reading them. The sheer calculation of the strategy made my blood run cold. They did not just want my money. They wanted to strip away my autonomy and turn me into an obedient puppet for their financial crimes." Julian had smiled in my face, kissed me goodnight, and planned my psychological ruin. "He miscalculated," I said quietly. "He underestimated who you are," Marcus corrected, "just like they underestimate me. But Julian is getting desperate. When you walked out of that restaurant, his entire plan collapsed. He panicked and stole the wedding fund to cover the immediate Cayman debt. But that is just a temporary bandage. He still needs your diplomatic signature to save his father. and he is not going to stop until he forces your hand. I closed the folder, aligning the edges perfectly with the corner of my desk. Let him try, I replied. I am going to freeze every single asset attached to the Sterling name by noon. I am going to bury them in federal audits until they cannot afford a cup of coffee. Before Marcus could respond, the tranquil silence of the office shattered. A high-pitched siren wailed from the overhead speakers. The red security light above my door began to flash with a harsh, rhythmic pulse. Agent Davis burst into the room, his hand resting firmly on his holstered weapon. Madam Ambassador, we have a breach protocol in the main lobby, Davis reported, his voice crisp and urgent. I stood up. Who breached the perimeter? It is your former future mother-in-law. Beatrice Sterling is downstairs, Davis said. She bypassed the outer gates by tailgating a press corps vehicle. She is currently standing in the center of the diplomatic reception area, and she is not alone. My desk phone began to ring. I pressed the speaker button. The frantic voice of the head receptionist echoed through the room. Madam Ambassador, I am so sorry to interrupt. There is a woman named Beatrice screaming in the lobby. She brought 3 reporters from the city tabloids. They have cameras. She is refusing to leave. What exactly is she screaming? I asked, my tone steady. The receptionist hesitated. She is telling the reporters that you are a con artist. She claims you embezzled $150,000 from her son last night. She is waving printed bank statements around. She says if you do not come down and face her right now, she is going to publish a story proving you stole the Sterling family fortune. Marcus stood up from his chair. He looked at me, a dangerous glint in his eye. They are playing the media card. They are trying to back you into a corner. I reached for my suit jacket draped over the back of my chair. Beatrice Sterling thought a few flashing cameras and loud accusations would make a diplomat crumble. She was about to learn a harsh lesson about how real power operates. Agent Davis, I said, slipping my arms into my jacket. Call the lobby security team. Tell them to unlock the press barriers. Let the cameras roll. I am going downstairs. The stainless steel doors of the elevator glided shut. Agent Davis stood to my right. His posture was rigid. The digital display counted down the floors. We were descending from the secure diplomatic suites into the public reception area. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket. My mind categorized the incoming threats. Beatrice Sterling was not a mastermind. She was a desperate socialite trying to play a high-stakes political game without understanding the rules. She relied on public shame to manipulate her targets. She expected me to cower from tabloid exposure. The elevator doors chimed and parted. The United Nations reception hall was usually a sanctuary of hushed voices and polished marble. Today, it resembled a circus. Beatrice stood in the center of the vast room. She wore a tailored crimson coat. 3 individuals with digital recorders and heavy cameras flanked her. They wore cheap suits and aggressive expressions. Tabloid journalists looking for a quick payout. When Beatrice saw me step out of the elevator, a predatory smile stretched across her face. It was the look of a cornered animal that mistakenly believes it has gained the upper hand. She marched forward, flanked by her rented audience. Agent Davis stepped in front of me, but I placed a hand on his shoulder. I wanted them to come closer. Beatrice stopped a few feet away. She shoved a digital audio recorder toward my face. In her other hand, she held a thick document bound in a blue legal folder. "Smile for the cameras, Chloe," Beatrice sneered. Her voice echoed off the marble walls, intentionally loud enough to draw the attention of nearby international delegates. "I have a very simple proposition for you. You are going to take this pen. You are going to sign this government guarantee for the Sterling Real Estate Group." I glanced at the blue folder. It was a federal bailout request. Julian had sent his mother to do his dirty work. And if I decline, I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level. Beatrice let out a harsh, theatrical laugh. She turned to the reporters, making sure they caught every word. "If you decline, these lovely journalists from the New York Post will publish their front-page story tomorrow morning. The headline is already written. United Nations Ambassador defrauds fiancé of wedding funds. We have the banking statements showing a frozen account. We will tell the world you used your political authority to embezzle $150,000 from a hard-working American family." Her strategy was transparent. She had taken my defensive action of freezing the joint account and twisted it into an offensive crime. She knew the money was routed to the Cayman Islands. She knew her son stole it. But truth does not matter in tabloid journalism. Only the narrative matters. A corruption scandal involving a federal diplomat and stolen wedding funds would be a public relations nightmare. It would trigger internal investigations and suspension. Beatrice was attempting to hold my career hostage for a bailout signature. "You are holding a fraudulent narrative," Beatrice, I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the cavernous hall. "You cannot blackmail a federal entity with a tabloid article." Before Beatrice could respond, another figure stepped out from behind the journalists. It was Vivian, the sister of Julian. She was holding a smartphone mounted on a stabilizer stick. The screen displayed an active Instagram live broadcast. Thousands of viewers were tuning in. Vivian had perfectly applied waterproof mascara, but her eyes were red and puffy. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. "Look at her," Vivian cried into the camera lens, her voice trembling with rehearsed sorrow. "This is the woman my brother loved. We welcomed her into our home. And how does she repay us? She uses her political power to crush our family business. She stole my brother's life savings. She is trying to ruin us because we discovered she was a fraud. Please, everyone, share this broadcast. The world needs to know how corrupt these diplomats really are." The sheer audacity of the lie was almost impressive. They were trying to weaponize public outrage. They wanted angry citizens flooding the United Nations switchboards demanding my resignation. Vivian stepped closer, thrusting the phone camera toward my face to capture my reaction. She wanted anger. She wanted me to shout, to slap the phone away, to give them the viral clip of an unhinged, aggressive politician. I gave them nothing. I stood perfectly still. My expression remained entirely blank. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the awkward, heavy atmosphere of their own making. The journalists shifted uncomfortably. They expected a screaming match. They did not expect a stone wall. "You have 30 seconds to sign the contract, Chloe," Beatrice hissed, dropping the theatrical volume. "Sign it, or we ruin you." I turned my head slowly to look at Agent Davis. "Escort these unauthorized individuals out of the building. Confiscate the cameras. If they resist, detain them for federal trespassing." Agent Davis nodded once. He raised 2 fingers. 6 additional federal security officers materialized from the surrounding corridors. They moved with swift, silent precision. They formed a tactical wedge between me and the Sterling women. The journalists immediately lowered their cameras, recognizing the severe legal consequences of resisting federal agents on diplomatic soil. "Hey, you cannot do this," Beatrice shrieked as an agent firmly grasped her arm. "We have freedom of the press. We are exposing a criminal." Vivian dropped her phone, the live stream cutting out as it hit the marble floor. "Do not touch me," she screamed, struggling against the security detail. "You are all corrupt. Julian is right about you, Chloe. You are a monster." I watched them being herded toward the revolving glass doors. Beatrice was kicking and shouting obscenities that echoed through the lobby. The polished facade of the wealthy Manhattan socialite had shattered, revealing the desperate, greedy reality beneath. The heavy glass doors rotated, pushing them out onto the busy New York street. The silence in the lobby returned. I smoothed the lapel of my jacket. I had weathered their public ambush without offering a single word of ammunition. The media extortion campaign had failed to secure the signature. They were running out of leverage. My encrypted phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. The notification indicated a secure voicemail had bypassed my civilian filters. The sender was Julian. I tapped the screen and held the speaker near my ear. Julian's voice was low, devoid of any of the panic I had seen at the restaurant. It was a cold, venomous drawl. "Chloe," he began, "I see you did not sign the paperwork for my mother. That was a poor decision. You think you can just hide behind your security guards. You think freezing the bank account makes you untouchable. Let me make this very clear." I listened, my face betraying no emotion. "During the 2 years we lived together," Julian continued, "I installed hidden cameras in the bedroom and the bathroom of our apartment. I have hundreds of hours of footage. If that federal bailout is not approved by tomorrow morning, I am not going to the tabloids with a financial story. I am going to the dark web." My breath caught in my throat. "I have already hired a digital studio to enhance the footage into deepfake explicit content featuring your face," Julian said. "It is highly realistic. When I hit send, every foreign ambassador, every United Nations delegate, and every major news outlet will receive a link. Your reputation will not just be tarnished. You will be a global laughingstock. Your diplomatic career will burn to ashes. Sign the contract, Chloe. This is your last warning." The audio message clicked off. I lowered the phone. The air in my lungs felt like ice. Beatrice and Vivian had tried to manipulate me with public shame and financial lies. Those were standard, albeit desperate, corporate tactics. But Julian had crossed the ultimate boundary. He had weaponized violation. He had moved from financial extortion to sexual blackmail. He was threatening to distribute illicit material to destroy my life. The patience I had maintained, the professional restraint I had exercised as a diplomat, evaporated in an instant. The diplomatic protocols no longer applied. Julian Sterling was no longer a civilian requiring careful handling. He was a hostile threat, aiming to compromise a federal official. I turned around. Marcus was standing near the elevator bank. He had witnessed the entire scene in the lobby. He read the shift in my demeanor. The professional mask had dropped. "What did he do?" Marcus asked. His voice was low and serious. I looked at Marcus. My eyes were cold and empty of mercy. I walked toward the elevator, signaling for Marcus to follow me back up to the secure suite. "Julian just signed his own arrest warrant," I said, stepping into the elevator car. Marcus followed, turning to face the closing doors. "What is the next move?" The stainless steel doors sealed us inside. I looked straight ahead at the reflection in the polished metal. "Begin the financial hunt," I ordered. "We are tearing down their entire empire." The morning after Julian delivered his threat of digital sexual blackmail, his strategy pivoted with jarring speed. A delivery arrived at the federal security desk on the ground floor. It was an arrangement of 24 white lilies. Tucked inside the floral paper was a handwritten note. "Let us talk, just the two of us. Our old spot in Soho at noon. No lawyers, no family. Just us. I want to fix this." I sat at my mahogany desk and stared at the card. The sudden shift from explicit threats to romantic reconciliation was a classic manipulation tactic. Julian was attempting to play the role of the reluctant aggressor, offering me a peaceful exit from the nightmare he had created. Marcus stood near the window of my office, reading the note over my shoulder. He let out a low breath and stated that Julian was setting a trap. Marcus knew his brother-in-law better than anyone. Julian never retreated unless he was drawing his target into a tighter corner. I agreed with Marcus. It was an obvious snare, but it was also a golden opportunity. Threatening a federal diplomat over a voicemail was one crime, but attempting to force a government signature through direct extortion was a much heavier federal offense. I needed him to state his terms clearly. I needed the quid pro quo recorded on a secure channel. I contacted the Federal Investigation Division. Within an hour, a technician arrived at my suite. She affixed a micro-recording device beneath the collar of my blazer. The transmitter fed a live audio stream directly to a secure server monitored by federal agents. If Julian crossed the line from personal blackmail to government extortion, the trap would snap shut on him instead of me. At noon, my armored vehicle pulled up to a small, dimly lit Italian restaurant in Soho. It was the place Julian and I used to frequent during the first year of our relationship. Back then, I played the role of a struggling administrative worker, and he played the role of a humble real estate heir trying to make his own way. The nostalgia of the venue was a calculated choice on his part. He wanted to disarm me with memories. I instructed my security detail to remain in the vehicles. I needed Julian to feel fully in control. I walked through the main dining room, breathing in the familiar scent of roasted garlic and aged wood. The hostess did not seat me at a quiet table for two. Instead, she guided me toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room in the back. I pushed the doors open. The romantic illusion evaporated instantly. Julian was not waiting alone with a quiet apology. He stood at the far end of a long dining table, his arms crossed over his chest. Seated around the table was the entire Sterling family. Richard sat at the head, radiating the unearned arrogance of a man who believed the city belonged to him. Beatrice sat to his right, casually sipping a martini with a look of supreme satisfaction. Vivian sat next to her, tapping away on her smartphone. Flanking the family were three men in aggressive pinstripe suits. Their leather briefcases rested on the table. They were high-priced defense attorneys, the kind retained by wealthy families to bully their way out of consequences. Julian instructed the hostess to close the doors. The heavy oak shut with a solid click, sealing us inside the windowless room. The atmosphere immediately grew thick and suffocating. "You brought an audience, Julian," I said, keeping my voice calm and measured. The federal wire taped to my collar picked up every syllable. Julian gestured toward an empty chair at the opposite end of the table. "Have a seat, Chloe. We are not here to argue. We are here to offer you a way out of the mess you created." I remained standing. I did not take the seat they had designated for me. The men in the pinstripe suits watched me with predatory amusement. They assumed I was an out-of-depth civil servant about to be crushed by superior legal firepower. Richard Sterling cleared his throat. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You made a spectacle of my wife yesterday. You froze assets that do not belong to you. And now my son tells me you are being stubborn about a simple government guarantee. We are a reasonable family, Chloe. We believe in second chances." Julian stepped forward and picked up a thick, leather-bound document from the center of the table. He tossed it so it slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from my hands. It was 50 pages thick. The title page bore the bold heading of a prenuptial agreement. "Sign it," Julian commanded. His voice was cold, devoid of any affection or hesitation. "You sign this document today, and the media leaks stop. The deepfake studio deletes the footage. The entire public scandal disappears, and we go back to planning our wedding." I looked down at the document, then back at Julian. I needed him to explicitly state the terms for the recording. "What exactly am I signing, Julian?" One of the attorneys, a man sitting on the left, opened his copy of the document. He spoke with a condescending drawl, treating me like a slow child. "It is a standard protective agreement," he said. "It requires you to transfer 80% of your current and future assets into a trust managed by the Sterling family." I raised an eyebrow. "And my professional authority." Julian answered that part. "The contract gives Sterling Real Estate Group full discretionary proxy over any government investment funds under your purview. You will assign us as the primary contractors for the Foreign Direct Investment Initiative. My father gets the capital he needs, and you get to keep your pristine reputation." I let the sheer audacity of the demand settle in the room. They were not just trying to steal my money, they were attempting a hostile takeover of a United Nations trade portfolio. They were documenting federal treason in a marital contract. "And if the marriage fails?" I asked smoothly. Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She stirred her martini with an olive skewer. "If you decide to be difficult and file for divorce, the contract stipulates a $10 million penalty fee for emotional distress caused to our family. Consider it a deposit for our continued silence." They had boxed themselves in perfectly. The audio recording now contained undeniable proof of blackmail, extortion, and attempted fraud against the federal government. They felt entirely secure in their leverage. They believed the threat of digital sexual humiliation would paralyze my logic and force my hand. They thought shame was a heavier weight than federal law. The lead attorney, seated directly to the right of Richard, finally shifted in his chair. He was the architect of this absurd legal trap. He wore a custom-tailored suit and possessed the sleek, overconfident posture of a man who spent his life intimidating vulnerable people. He picked up his expensive gold pen and cleared his throat, preparing to read the binding signature clauses to formalize the extortion. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or threaten them with the agents waiting outside. I simply shifted my gaze away from Julian and focused entirely on the lead attorney. I let a slow, sharp smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the cold, calculating smile of a predator recognizing its prey. The attorney began to speak, his eyes focused on the pages in front of him. "Pursuant to Section 4 of the binding asset transfer, you will acknowledge that—" His words trailed off as he lifted his head. He looked across the long table. His eyes met mine. I held his gaze, my smile deepening into something lethal. For 3 seconds the room was silent. The attorney stopped moving. The arrogant smirk on his face dissolved, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. His hand began to tremble, causing the gold pen to tap erratically against the wooden table. He recognized me. He knew exactly who he was looking at, and he knew instantly that he had just committed career suicide. The lawyer sitting to the right of Richard Sterling was named David. 5 years ago, David was a junior legal clerk at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. I was the lead prosecutor on a multinational corporate fraud tribunal at the time. David used to bring me coffee and organize my case files while I dismantled European financial syndicates. He sat in the gallery and watched me cross-examine warlords and corrupt officials. He knew firsthand that I did not negotiate with criminals. He knew I buried them. Now he sat across from me in a private dining room in Manhattan, holding a fraudulent prenuptial agreement designed to extort a federal diplomat. His hands shook so violently that the expensive gold pen slipped from his grip and clattered onto the heavy oak table. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly shade of gray. He refused to make eye contact with anyone in the room, keeping his gaze fixed firmly on the polished wood in front of him. "I apologize, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," David stammered frantically, gathering his legal pads and shoving them into his leather briefcase. He pushed his chair back so fast it tipped onto two legs before slamming back down. "I must recuse myself. I refuse to represent this case." Beatrice slammed her manicured hands onto the table. The olive skewer in her martini glass rattled against the crystal. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "We pay your firm a premium retainer to handle our affairs. Sit down and read the document to her." David did not sit down. He backed away from the table, clutching his briefcase against his chest like a shield. "You did not inform me of the opposing party's identity," he said, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "I am leaving. Do not contact my office again." He turned and practically ran out of the private dining room. He left the heavy oak doors slightly ajar, letting the ambient noise of the restaurant spill into the tense silence of our space. Richard Sterling shifted in his seat. His arrogant posture dissolved into visible confusion. The other two junior attorneys exchanged nervous glances and quietly closed their folders. They sensed the immense legal danger in the room, even if they did not understand the specific history between David and myself. They recognized that a senior partner fleeing a room meant they were standing on a landmine. Julian, however, lacked basic survival instincts. His inflated ego could not process the retreat of his legal counsel. He saw his carefully constructed extortion plan unraveling right in front of his eyes. The realization that he was losing control of the narrative ignited a blind, volatile rage. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, and marched down the length of the table toward me. "Who do you think you are?" Julian roared. The sophisticated facade of the Manhattan finance heir vanished completely. He was reduced to an angry, entitled man throwing a desperate tantrum. "You think you can intimidate my lawyers and just walk away. You think you are better than us." I stood my ground. My posture remained relaxed, but highly alert. The federal wire taped beneath my collar was capturing every threatening syllable. "Your lawyers possess common sense, Julian, something you clearly lack." Julian lunged forward. He abandoned all pretense of a civil negotiation. His hand shot out and clamped around my right wrist with brutal, unforgiving force. His fingers dug into my skin, grinding bone against bone. The grip was meant to inflict immediate physical pain, an attempt to physically dominate me into submission. "You are going to sign this paper right now." He spat his face inches from mine. A vein pulsed visibly in his neck. "You are not leaving this room until my father gets his money." A sharp, stinging ache radiated up my arm. Red marks were already blooming under his tight grasp, cutting off my circulation. The federal security agents waiting outside the restaurant were seconds away from breaching the doors, but I did not have seconds. I relied on the close-quarters defensive training mandated for high-risk diplomatic envoys. I planted my feet firmly to establish a solid center of gravity. I twisted my arm against the weak point of his thumb and yanked my wrist backward with a swift, explosive motion. The sudden release of tension threw Julian completely off balance. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished wood floor. He flailed his arms, desperate to catch himself, but crashed hard against the back of a heavy wooden dining chair. The chair tipped over, sending him tumbling onto the floor in a tangled heap of limbs and tailored fabric. At that exact fraction of a second, the heavy oak doors burst wide open. The blinding white light of camera flashes erupted from the corridor. 3 individuals holding professional photography equipment stood in the doorway. They were not my federal agents. They were the paparazzi Beatrice had intentionally planted in the main dining area. They had been waiting for a silent signal to ambush the private room. They rapidly pressed their shutters, capturing the precise moment I stood tall over a fallen, seemingly defenseless Julian. Beatrice let out a loud theatrical gasp. She covered her mouth with her hands, playing directly to the lenses. "Help him," she cried out, ensuring the audio would match the visual narrative. "She is attacking my son. Call the police." The setup was seamless. They had anticipated my refusal to sign the extortion documents. When the financial threat failed, they pivoted instantly to their backup plan. They needed an image to fit their destructive narrative. They needed visual proof of an aggressive, unhinged diplomat assaulting a helpless civilian. Agent Davis and the security team swarmed the corridor a moment later. They shoved the photographers aside with professional force and secured the perimeter of the room. They formed a tight protective ring around me, shielding me from the remaining cameras. "Secure the exit," I ordered, rubbing my bruised wrist. "We are leaving." I walked past Julian. He was still groaning on the floor, playing his victim role perfectly for his mother and the fleeing photographers. The paparazzi scrambled to avoid the federal agents rushing out the back exit, with their memory cards already loaded with the manufactured evidence. The ride back to the diplomatic safe house was heavy with tension. The tactical vehicle navigated the afternoon traffic while I applied a cold compress to my wrist. The deep purple bruises were forming clearly undeniable evidence of his assault. It was evidence that the tabloid cameras had conveniently ignored in favor of a more sensational angle. Less than 30 minutes after I left the restaurant, my encrypted phone began to vibrate incessantly. The digital smear campaign was executed with terrifying speed. My chief of staff forwarded the links directly to my secure inbox. The images were everywhere. Major social media platforms, gossip blogs, and digital news outlets shared the same grainy, high-contrast photograph. It showed me with my arm raised defensively, looking down at Julian sprawled on the restaurant floor. The headline on the leading tabloid read, "United Nations Ambassador Assaults, Fiancé in Brutal Public Rage." The accompanying article was a masterpiece of fiction. It claimed I had discovered Julian was breaking off the engagement due to my financial corruption, and in a fit of violent anger, I had physically attacked him. Beatrice was quoted as an anonymous source stating the family feared for their safety. They painted Julian as a brave survivor of domestic abuse. In the realm of international diplomacy, public perception is just as critical as actual policy. A federal official involved in a violent public altercation was a massive liability. The optics were disastrous for the trade initiatives I managed. Before I could instruct my public relations team to draft a counterstatement, the secure line to the State Department rang. It was the Undersecretary of Global Affairs. Her tone was brisk and devoid of any standard pleasantries. "Chloe, we have a crisis," the Undersecretary stated. "The European delegates are flooding my office with inquiries about the photos circulating online. The French and Japanese ministers are expressing deep concern over your stability. They are questioning the leadership of the Global Fund." "The incident was a staged ambush," I replied evenly. "Julian Sterling physically assaulted me. I executed a standard defensive release maneuver. My security detail can corroborate the exact sequence of events. Furthermore, I was wearing a federal audio transmitter during the meeting. We have the entire extortion attempt on record." "I know," the Undersecretary said, her tone softening just a fraction. "The Financial Crimes Division received the live audio feed. They are processing the evidence of blackmail right now. But the court of public opinion moves much faster than the justice system. The investors involved in the Foreign Direct Investment Initiative are threatening to pull their capital if you remain the face of the program. They do not care about the audio recording right now. They only care about the viral photograph of you standing over a man on the floor." I stared out the tinted window of the vehicle, watching the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan loom overhead. The Sterlings had cornered me. They could not force my signature, so they decided to paralyze my authority instead. "What is the directive?" I asked. The Undersecretary sighed heavily into the receiver. "I have to suspend your diplomatic clearance pending a formal investigation. It is standard protocol for any physical altercation involving a federal representative. You are barred from accessing the international trade servers. You cannot communicate with foreign delegates. You are grounded for the next 48 hours. The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone. The Sterlings had won the skirmish. By severing my access to the federal network, they believed they had rendered me powerless. They thought they had bound my hands just long enough to execute the final phase of their financial scheme. I turned to Marcus, who was sitting in the passenger seat of the vehicle. He had reviewed the viral posts on his own device. He looked at me, waiting for my reaction. The Sterlings thought a temporary suspension would break my resolve. They did not realize that stripping away my diplomatic restrictions meant I no longer had to play by the polite rules of government oversight. They locked me out of the federal system, I told Marcus, my voice dropping to a chilling whisper, which means I am officially off the clock. Marcus closed his laptop. He understood the exact implication of my words. What do you need me to do? I looked at the dark bruises marking my wrist. The time for defensive bureaucratic maneuvers had expired. The Sterlings had brought a tabloid camera to a financial war. Beatrice relies on her high society reputation. I set a dark, methodical strategy forming in my mind. Let us see how well that reputation holds up when her country club friends find out where their retirement funds actually went. The heavy steel door of my civilian apartment locked behind me with a hollow thud. For the first time in 5 years, my federal identification badge was nothing more than a piece of useless plastic. I set my government-issued laptop on the kitchen island and opened the lid. The screen glowed a harsh, solid blue. A brief text prompt confirmed my status. Access denied. Protocol suspension active. The 48-hour clock had officially started ticking. I stood in the center of the dark living room, illuminated only by the streetlights spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Stripping a diplomat of their clearance does more than halt their work. It severs their connection to the global grid. I could not view foreign market fluctuations. I could not authorize humanitarian aid packages. I could not communicate on secured channels with the trade ministers who relied on my directives. The Sterling family had successfully blinded me, and now they were moving in for the kill. My civilian smartphone vibrated on the marble counter. Unlike my federal device, this phone remained active, making it the perfect conduit for the poison Beatrice Sterling was currently injecting into the Manhattan social ecosystem. I picked up the device and scrolled through my inbox. The sheer speed of high society betrayal was a fascinating psychological study. Just a week ago, these same socialites and corporate board members sent me daily invitations to charity galas, eager to secure a photograph next to the youngest trade ambassador in the United Nations. They had sent me vintage wines and praised my economic policies. Now the digital silence was deafening. The silence was occasionally broken by cowardly text messages from acquaintances, eager to distance themselves. The wife of a prominent state senator texted me a brief note canceling our scheduled philanthropy luncheon, citing a sudden scheduling conflict. 2 prominent gallery directors removed my name from their benefactor lists. The elite crowd operates on a simple, ruthless algorithm. They flock to power and they sprint away from scandal. Beatrice understood this algorithm perfectly, and she was exploiting it to ensure my social execution. I poured myself a glass of cold water and leaned against the counter watching the messages roll in. Beatrice was not just letting the tabloid photo do the work. She was actively fanning the flames from her throne at the Sterling Country Club. Through a loyal informant who worked as an event coordinator at the club, I received a real-time account of the smear campaign. Beatrice was currently holding court in the Platinum dining room. She moved from table to table, clutching a glass of champagne, playing the role of the traumatized mother. She was feeding the rumor mill a steady diet of venom. She told the wives of hedge fund managers that my diplomatic credentials were a farce. She insinuated that my swift rise through the international ranks was not the result of rigorous education and geopolitical strategy, but rather the product of late-night favors traded with senior political figures. She painted me as an opportunistic grifter who had targeted her wealthy, innocent son to elevate my own status. Her strategy was a classic character assassination. When you cannot attack a woman on the merits of her intellect or her achievements, you attack her morality. Beatrice wanted the elite circle to view me as a cheap fraud. The phone vibrated again. This notification brought a sharper, more dangerous threat. It was an email forwarded from an attaché within the Japanese embassy, a man I had negotiated a tech manufacturing treaty with just last month. He attached a message that had bypassed standard diplomatic filters, landing in the primary inboxes of 12 different foreign embassies across the city. I opened the document. It was an anonymous dossier. The sender IP was masked, but the author was unmistakable. The email claimed to offer a confidential warning to foreign dignitaries regarding the special trade ambassador. It alleged that I was under active investigation for federal embezzlement and domestic abuse. It warned that any foreign capital entrusted to my oversight was at risk of being siphoned into personal offshore accounts. Beatrice was no longer just playing a social game. She was attempting to sabotage international relations. By planting these seeds of doubt in the minds of foreign diplomats, she was ensuring that even if my suspension lifted my credibility on the global stage, would be irreparably fractured. Investors would hesitate. Treaties would stall. My career would suffer a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 anonymous cuts. I set the glass of water down. The apartment felt suffocating. They thought I would spend these 48 hours weeping in the dark, mourning my reputation, and drafting a letter of resignation. They expected me to surrender. A sharp, rapid knocking at my front door shattered the silence. I did not jump. I checked the security monitor installed near the entryway. The camera feed showed Marcus standing in the dimly lit hallway. I was out of breath. His tie was pulled loose, and he kept glancing nervously over his shoulder toward the elevator bank. I unbolted the door and pulled it open. Marcus slipped inside before I could even step back, shutting the door behind him and throwing the deadbolt. He leaned against the heavy wood, exhaling a long, ragged breath. "I told the lobby concierge to let you up," I said, studying his disheveled appearance. "You look like you ran from Midtown." Marcus walked past me and headed straight for the kitchen island. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small metallic object. He tossed it onto the marble counter. It landed with a heavy clink. It was a military-grade encrypted USB drive. "They are preparing one final strike," Marcus said, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "You getting suspended was not just a bonus for them, Chloe. It was the prerequisite for their actual endgame." I looked at the silver drive resting on the counter, then back to Marcus. "Explain." Marcus paced the length of the living room. Julian is not waiting for a government bailout anymore. He knows that bridge is burned. He knows his father is going to face indictment soon. So Julian is orchestrating his own exit strategy, and he is using your name to do it. I crossed my arms. "He cannot use my name. My signature authority is locked." "He does not need your signature," Marcus countered, stopping in front of me. "He just needs your ghost." Julian has organized a high-stakes investment gala for this Saturday night at the Waldorf Astoria. He rented the grand ballroom. He sent out invitations weeks ago to foreign diplomats, sovereign wealth fund managers, and international venture capitalists. I processed the information. A gala of that magnitude required months of planning and millions in capital staging. Why would foreign investors attend a gala hosted by a failing real estate firm? Because the invitations brand him as the future husband of the United Nations Special Trade Ambassador, Marcus revealed. He is leveraging your geopolitical weight to legitimize his event. He is spinning the tabloid drama as a minor lover's quarrel, assuring the investors that your diplomatic backing remains firmly intact behind closed doors. He is selling them a ghost project, a massive, non-existent eco-city development in Eastern Europe. I stared at Marcus, the sheer scale of the fraud settling over me. He wants them to invest in a phantom city. Marcus nodded grimly. He is aiming to secure $50 million in capital commitments by the end of Saturday night. Once the foreign money hits the sterling holding accounts, Julian is going to wire the funds directly to the Cayman cartels to clear his father of the immediate debt. He plans to take a cut for himself, file for corporate bankruptcy on Monday morning, and leave the foreign investors holding a worthless piece of paper. The consequences of his plan clicked into a terrifying sequence in my mind. If Julian succeeded in extracting $50 million from foreign dignitaries under the perceived umbrella of my diplomatic authority, the fallout would be catastrophic. The international community would not blame a failed real estate heir. They would blame the United Nations ambassador, who supposedly vetted the deal. My global reputation would not just evaporate. I would likely face international prosecution for conspiracy to commit systemic fraud. Julian was planning to use me as his bulletproof shield while he robbed the global elite. Saturday is tomorrow, I noted the ticking clock growing louder in my head. My suspension does not lift until 6 o'clock tomorrow evening, which is exactly why he scheduled the gala for 7 o'clock, Marcus said. He knows you are sidelined right now. He knows you cannot issue official government warnings to the embassies. By the time your system access is restored, the champagne will be poured, the contracts will be signed, and the money will be routing overseas. He thinks you are trapped in this apartment, powerless to stop him. I turned my attention to the metallic USB drive resting on the cool marble. The dim streetlights caught the edge of the metal, making it gleam like a drawn weapon. "What is on the drive, Marcus?" Marcus followed my gaze. Everything, he answered quietly. Every forged deed, every fake environmental assessment for the ghost city, the Cayman routing numbers, the internal emails between Julian and his father discussing the Ponzi structure. I bypassed their internal firewall this afternoon and downloaded the entire black ledger. If they find out I took it, they will ruin my legal career. They will have Vivian strip my assets in divorce court. "You took a massive risk bringing this to me," I said, meeting his eyes. Marcus held my gaze, his expression hardening with resolve. "I am tired of watching them destroy innocent people to maintain their illusion of wealth. I am tired of playing the grateful son-in-law. They need to be stopped." I picked up the USB drive. The metal felt cold and heavy in my palm. The Sterlings had spent 48 hours trying to bury me in the dark. They had orchestrated a smear campaign, weaponized the media, and attempted to assassinate my character among the social elite. They believed they had effectively neutralized the threat I posed. They were about to learn a harsh truth about how a predator operates when cornered. I did not need federal credentials to dismantle a fraud. I just needed the data. I walked over to a concealed wall panel near my bookshelf and punched in a manual override code. The panel slid open, revealing an offline, untraceable terminal I used for deep-level geopolitical analysis. "Saturday night is going to be a very memorable event," I said, inserting the drive into the secure terminal. "Let us see what hides in the dark." The screen of the offline terminal flickered to life in the dark apartment. The decryption software chewed through the secured drive Marcus had provided. Rows of data flooded the monitor. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes tracking the endless columns of routing numbers, offshore shell entities, and wire transfer logs. We were no longer playing defense. We were compiling the ammunition to end a dynasty. The Sterling family black ledger was a masterpiece of financial deception. Richard Sterling had built a labyrinth of dummy corporations. He transferred capital from one shell company to another, creating the illusion of thriving real estate developments. But the truth was buried in the outgoing columns. The funds were not buying steel or concrete. They were paying off early investors, funding the lavish charity galas Beatrice hosted, and sustaining a lifestyle built entirely on theft. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme executed with terrifying precision. Marcus stood behind me, his arms crossed tight over his chest. He pointed a finger at a specific folder named Horizon Trust. "Open that one," he instructed, his voice thick with a quiet, suppressed rage. I clicked the file. A list of individual accounts populated the screen. They were not wealthy foreign dignitaries or anonymous hedge funds. They were municipal workers, teachers, and transit operators. It was a regional pension fund. "I grew up in those neighborhoods," Marcus said, staring at the depleted account balances. When I made partner at my firm, Richard approached me. He played the role of the benevolent mentor. He convinced me to bring the community pension fund into the Sterling portfolio, promising guaranteed high-yield returns to secure the retirements of people who had worked hard their entire lives. I vouched for him. I stood in front of union leaders and told them Richard Sterling was a safe bet. Marcus let out a harsh breath, the weight of the deception pressing down on him. Richard used my face, my credibility in the African-American community to harvest their life savings, and then he bled the fund dry to pay for his offshore debts. The disdain the Sterlings showed at the dinner table was just surface-level arrogance. Their real cruelty was systemic. They viewed vulnerable communities as nothing more than a resource to be consumed and discarded. The engagement dinner insult paled in comparison to the generational wealth they were actively stealing. Richard Sterling had turned his own son-in-law into an unwitting accomplice in the robbery of his own people. We needed a secure environment to finalize the logistics of our counterattack. My apartment was a known location, and the United Nations suites were locked out to me. The next morning, we met at an unassuming independent coffee shop, tucked away on a quiet street in Brooklyn. It was a small space with exposed brick walls, the scent of roasted beans masking the tension between us. We sat at a corner table far from the windows, 2 steaming mugs untouched between us. "We cannot just hand this drive to the Federal Bureau," I told Marcus, sliding a printed schematic of the Gala guest list across the wooden table. "Richard has politicians in his pocket. A standard investigation will take months. They will tie it up in litigation, shred the documents, and move the remaining cash before a judge ever signs a warrant. We need to trap them in the act of committing the crime. Marcus reviewed the Gala timeline. Julian intends to pitch the Ghost City project to the foreign delegates at 8 o'clock tonight. He will distribute the investment commitment forms by 8:30. The funds will route through a temporary escrow gateway. We wait for the signatures. We wait for the foreign capital to enter the holding account. Then I use my emergency backdoor access to trigger a global financial freeze. Julian will be caught initiating a fraudulent international wire transfer in front of 300 witnesses. I need the internal server bypass codes from the Sterling network, I said. I need a direct tunnel into their accounting software so I can monitor the transaction in real time. Can you get me past their firewall? Marcus pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket. He slid it across the table. I hard-coded a backdoor access key last night. You will have full visibility of their ledger the moment the gala begins. I reached for the paper. My fingers were inches from the code when a jarring explosive crash rattled the entire coffee shop. The heavy glass of the front window shuddered with terrifying force. A few customers gasped, spilling their drinks. I whipped my head around toward the street. Julian Sterling stood on the sidewalk just outside the window. The gray morning light cast harsh shadows across his face. He did not look like the polished heir to a real estate fortune. His designer coat was unbuttoned, his hair disheveled. His face was twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unchecked fury. He slammed his fist against the thick glass a second time, his eyes locked dead onto Marcus. He stormed toward the entrance of the shop. I looked down at my leather handbag resting on the chair next to me. The realization hit me with cold clarity. He had not just stumbled upon us in Brooklyn. During the months we lived together, Julian had slipped a micro-tracking device deep into the lining of my bag. He had been monitoring my exact coordinates, tracking my movements while I was suspended, ensuring I was not meeting with federal authorities. Instead, his tracker led him straight to his own brother-in-law. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful note that contrasted sharply with the danger entering the room. Julian shoved past a startled barista and marched straight toward our corner table. His breathing was heavy, ragged. The sheer paranoia and jealousy had eroded whatever rational thought he had left. He did not care about the public setting. He did not care about the witnesses. I knew it, Julian roared, his voice echoing off the exposed brick walls. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Marcus. You are conspiring with this bitch to stab my family in the back. No wonder you defended her at the restaurant. You two have been plotting against us this whole time. Marcus remained remarkably calm. He stood up from the table, shifting his weight to place himself between Julian and me. Julian, you need to lower your voice and walk out that door. You have no idea what you are doing right now. Shut up! Julian spat, closing the distance until he was inches from Marcus. You ungrateful parasite. My father gave you a career. We gave you a seat at our table, and this is how you repay us, by sleeping with my ex-fiancé and trying to ruin my gala. Julian was operating on pure toxic delusion. He could not comprehend that a woman he deemed inferior and a man he considered mere hired help could outsmart him financially. In his warped mind, the only logical explanation for our secret meeting was a romantic affair and a petty betrayal. The stress of his collapsing empire, the stolen funds, and the impending gala had pushed him over the edge. You are going to hand over whatever she gave you, Julian demanded, his eyes darting to the folded paper on the table. Marcus did not flinch. He did not step aside. Julian let out a guttural sound of frustration. He drew his right arm back, clenching his hand into a tight fist, and swung with all his remaining strength straight at the face of Marcus. The force behind Julian's swing was driven entirely by panicked adrenaline. He was not a fighter. He was a man accustomed to threatening people with lawsuits and family wealth. Marcus, on the other hand, had grown up in neighborhoods where physical posturing meant nothing if you could not back it up. Before Julian's fist could connect, Marcus stepped smoothly inside the arc of the swing. He caught Julian's forearm with a swift, punishing grip, twisted it outward, and locked Julian's arm sharply behind his back. Julian let out a sharp yelp of pain, his face contorting as Marcus bent him forward over the edge of the coffee shop table. Coffee cups clattered. A ceramic mug shattered on the floor. You need to calm down, Julian, Marcus said. His voice was dangerously quiet, the tone of a man exerting massive restraint. If I wanted to hurt you, you would already be on the floor. Let me go. You piece of garbage! Julian snarled, struggling futilely against the hold. His expensive coat bunched awkwardly around his shoulders. I remained seated, sliding the folded paper containing the firewall backdoor code smoothly into my pocket. The spectacle was drawing stares from every customer in the shop. A barista hovered near the counter holding a phone, likely preparing to call the police. Before I could instruct her to stand down, the chime above the entrance rang violently again. Vivian stormed through the door. The sister of Julian and wife to Marcus moved with the frantic entitlement-fueled energy characteristic of the Sterling family. She must have been waiting in the car while Julian tracked the GPS signal. She took one look at her brother pinned over a table by her husband, and all rational thought evaporated. Vivian did not ask for an explanation. She did not look at me. She marched straight up to Marcus, raised her hand, and slapped him across the face with a resounding crack that silenced the entire cafe. "Let go of my brother right now," she screamed. Marcus released his grip immediately, stepping back with his hands raised. He did not touch his cheek where a red mark was already blooming. He just looked at his wife of 5 years. The disappointment in his eyes was heavier than any anger. "He swung at me," Vivian Marcus stated calmly. I stopped him. "I do not care what he did," Vivian shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "You do not touch my family. We gave you everything. We pulled you out of whatever sad, pathetic law firm you were rotting in and gave you a real career. And you repay us by sneaking around Brooklyn with this fraud." Vivian finally turned her venomous glare toward me. "I knew it. I knew you were nothing but a social climbing parasite. You get suspended from your little government job, and the first thing you do is try to sleep with my husband to secure a new meal ticket." The psychological manipulation was staggering. Vivian and Julian had constructed a completely fabricated reality to justify their own failures. They needed Marcus to be an ungrateful traitor, and they needed me to be a desperate seductress. It was the only way they could avoid confronting the massive financial crimes their father had committed. Julian rubbed his shoulder, straightening his coat with a sneer. He had regained his arrogant composure the second his sister arrived to run interference. He looked at Marcus, then down at the table where the paper had been. "You think you are clever," Marcus, Julian sneered. "You think downloading a few internal files gives you leverage. Let me tell you how this is going to play out." Julian pulled his phone from his pocket, holding it up for us to see. A photograph was displayed on the screen. It was a picture of Marcus and me sitting closely at the table, leaning in over the documents taken through the cafe window before Julian burst in. To anyone without context, it looked incredibly intimate, a secret rendezvous in an obscure Brooklyn coffee shop. "I am sending this photo to the senior partners at your law firm," Julian said, his voice dripping with malice. "I am filing a formal complaint to the State Bar Association. I am going to claim that you are having an illicit affair with a disgraced federal official and that you stole confidential Sterling corporate documents to aid her in a personal vendetta against our family. They will strip your law license before Monday morning." He turned his attention to me. The triumphant smirk on his face was nauseating. "And as for you, Chloe, you are finished. The State Department does not tolerate diplomats caught in scandals, let alone ones who sleep with married men to retaliate against their former fiancés. No foreign delegate is ever going to take you seriously again." Julian stepped closer, leaning over the table. I could smell the expensive cologne he used to mask the scent of panic. "Tomorrow night at this gala, I am going to stand in front of 300 international investors. I am going to formally announce that our engagement is canceled because I discovered your financial and moral corruption. I am going to publicly vow to sue you for the emotional and financial damage you caused my family. You will be a pariah." Julian straightened up, adjusting his cuffs. "Give me the USB drive, Marcus. Hand it over, and maybe I will convince Vivian to let you keep a fraction of your dignity in the divorce." Marcus did not move. He looked at Vivian, who stood beside her brother, her arms crossed, her expression devoid of any love or loyalty. She had chosen her side. She had chosen the illusion of the Sterling dynasty over the man she married. "We do not have the drive on us," Julian Marcus said evenly. Julian laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Keep it, then. It does not matter. Without her diplomatic authority, whatever you think you have is useless. She is locked out. She is a civilian with a bruised reputation. You two deserve each other." He turned to his sister. "Let us go, Viv. We have a gala to prepare for. They have $50 million to secure." Vivian gave Marcus one last look of sheer contempt before turning on her heel and marching out the door. Julian followed her, the bell chiming a cheerful farewell to a man walking eagerly toward his own destruction. The cafe remained silent for several moments. I picked up my handbag, feeling the slight lump in the lining where Julian had concealed the tracker. I pulled a small penknife from my clutch, sliced the fabric, and extracted the tiny black disc. I dropped it into my half-empty coffee cup. It sank to the bottom with a quiet plop. "Are you okay?" I asked Marcus. Marcus touched his cheek. He let out a slow, steady breath. "I am fine." The marriage was dead the moment Richard asked me to lie to the pension board. She just finally signed the death certificate. He looked at me, a shadow of concern crossing his face. "He is going to use that photo, Chloe. He is going to spin this narrative at the gala. He genuinely believes you are powerless right now." I picked up the printed schematic of the gala guest list. The Sterlings operated on the assumption that power required a microphone, a television camera, or a public platform. They thought influence was a performance. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of federal authority. "Julian assumes my 48-hour suspension is a permanent exile," I said, folding the schematic neatly. He failed to check the exact timestamp of the disciplinary order. I looked at my watch. The digital numbers glowed clearly. My suspension was issued at 6 o'clock on Thursday evening. The 48-hour window would expire precisely at 6 o'clock tomorrow night. Julian's investment gala begins at 7 o'clock. I noted a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth, which means when he takes the stage to publicly humiliate me and steal $50 million from foreign delegates, my diplomatic clearance will be fully restored. And executing an international financial embargo does not require a press conference. It only requires a single authorized keystroke. I looked at Marcus. The Sterling family had played their final hand. "I need a dress for tomorrow night," I told him. "Black. No jewelry. We are going to a funeral. The Waldorf Astoria on a Saturday night is a monument to Manhattan excess. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light onto the polished marble floors of the grand foyer. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open the doors of arriving Maybachs and armored Mercedes. The Sterling family had spared no expense to create the illusion of impenetrable wealth. They had rented the grand ballroom, an opulent space that whispered of old money and generational power. To the casual observer, it was the social event of the season. To me, it was a crime scene waiting to be cordoned off. I arrived at precisely 6:45. I did not pull up in a diplomatic vehicle or arrive with a security detail. I stepped out of a standard black town car. I wore a floor-length tailored black gown. The fabric was severe architectural and entirely devoid of embellishment. I wore no jewelry, not even earrings. My hair was pulled back into a stark, practical knot. I was not there to participate in a social pageant. I was there to execute a surgical financial strike. As I approached the grand entrance of the ballroom, the scale of the Sterling operation became clear. Over 300 guests mingled inside. I recognized prominent faces from the global economic sector. There were sovereign wealth fund managers from the Middle East, venture capitalists from Silicon Valley, and key political figures who had likely been promised lucrative kickbacks. The Sterlings were attempting a heist of staggering proportions, wrapping their fraud in the legitimacy of the United Nations delegates they had tricked into attending. Beatrice Sterling stood at the primary entrance receiving guests with the practiced grace of a seasoned socialite. She wore a sapphire gown adorned with actual diamond accents that caught the light with obnoxious brilliance. She was in her element, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, and projecting the image of a matriarch steering a thriving empire. When her eyes landed on me, the gracious host persona shattered. Her smile hardened into a rigid, panicked line. She immediately raised a hand, signaling for the private security detail she had hired for the evening. 2 men in dark suits stepped forward, blocking my path to the ballroom doors. "You do not have a place here, Chloe," Beatrice hissed, keeping her voice low so the arriving dignitaries would not overhear. "You have some nerve showing your face after the scandal you caused. Turn around and leave before I have you arrested for trespassing." I did not break my stride until I was inches from the security guards. I folded my hands calmly in front of me. "This is a commercial event hosted in a public venue, Beatrice. I am afraid you do not have the authority to bar entry to federal personnel." Beatrice scoffed, her diamond necklace shifting as she crossed her arms. "You are not federal personnel anymore. You are a suspended disgrace. And you are certainly not on the guest list. Julian materialized from the crowd behind his mother. He held a crystal flute of champagne. He looked immaculate in a custom tuxedo, the picture of a successful real estate mogul. He saw the security guards blocking my path, and a smug, victorious grin spread across his face. He walked toward me, taking a slow sip of his drink, savoring what he believed was his ultimate triumph. "Well, well," Julian sneered, stopping beside Beatrice. "I have to admit I did not think you would actually show up. I thought you would be hiding in your apartment, packing your bags for whatever third-tier city the State Department exiles you to." He turned to the security guards, his tone dripping with condescension. "This woman is an uninvited guest. She has a history of erratic behavior and financial theft. Escort her out of the building immediately. If she resists, use force." The two guards stepped closer, their postures aggressive. "Ma'am, you need to leave the premises," the taller one commanded, reaching out to grasp my arm. I did not flinch. I did not back away. I looked Julian dead in the eye and checked the slim silver watch on my wrist. The digital display blinked. It was 6:59 and 40 seconds. "I am not leaving Julian," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the ambient noise of the gala. "I am waiting for my guests." Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Your guests? Who could you possibly have invited to my gala? The only people who associate with you now are disgraced lawyers who sleep with their clients." He was referring to Marcus, leaning into the fabricated narrative he planned to announce later that evening. Julian truly believed he controlled the reality of the situation. He believed the 48-hour suspension had permanently crippled my influence. He had spent the last 2 days building a throne of lies, completely unaware that the foundation had already been rigged with explosives. 10 seconds remained. Julian gestured dismissively to the guards. "Get her out of my sight. I have a $50 million presentation to give, and I do not want this thief polluting the entryway." The taller guard gripped my upper arm. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. The heavy brass-trimmed doors of the VIP private elevator bank, located directly behind Julian, slid open with a soft, melodic chime. The sudden movement drew the attention of the surrounding guests. The security guard hesitated, loosening his grip on my arm as he looked past me. Julian turned around, annoyance flashing across his face at the interruption. His annoyance transformed into profound confusion. Stepping out of the VIP elevator were 3 figures whose presence commanded immediate, breathless silence in international finance circles. They were the ministers of finance for France, Japan, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. These were not low-level attachés. These were the men who controlled the economic trajectories of entire nations. They moved with the synchronized, deliberate pace of men accustomed to wielding absolute power. Trailing closely behind them was a man Julian had never met, but whose identity I knew intimately. He wore a standard federal suit and carried a stark black briefcase. He was the lead director of the Federal Bureau of Economic Crimes. Julian lowered his champagne flute. He blinked, trying to process the impossible scene. He assumed these men were late arrivals to his investment pitch. He assumed they were here to pledge millions to his Ghost City project. He stepped forward, pasting his brightest, most obsequious smile onto his face, extending a hand to greet the French minister. "Minister Dubois, what a profound honor," Julian began, his voice slick with rehearsed charm. "We have a reserved table waiting for you near the presentation stage." The Minister of Finance for France did not take Julian's hand. He did not acknowledge Julian's existence. He walked straight past the extended hand, treating the heir to the sterling real estate empire like an invisible piece of furniture. The other 2 ministers followed suit, moving in a tight formation that bypassed Julian and Beatrice entirely. They walked directly up to me. The security guards immediately backed away, recognizing the immense geopolitical weight of the men approaching. The French minister stopped. He bowed his head in a gesture of deep, formal respect. Madam Ambassador Minister Dubois said, his voice clear and resonant, carrying to everyone standing in the foyer. "The international asset freeze has been executed exactly as you instructed. We have halted all capital routing to the sterling-designated holding accounts across our respective jurisdictions." The crystal champagne flute slipped from Julian's hand. It hit the marble floor, shattering into hundreds of glittering shards. The expensive liquid splashed across his polished leather shoes, but he did not notice. He was staring at the French minister, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, unable to comprehend the words he had just heard. Beatrice swayed on her feet, grabbing Julian's arm for support. The diamonds on her dress suddenly looked like cheap costume jewelry against her pale, terrified skin. "You see Julian?" I said, my voice cold and calm, echoing in the stunned silence of the entryway. "You assumed a 48-hour suspension meant I was powerless. You forgot to check the expiration time. My diplomatic clearance was fully restored at precisely 6 o'clock this evening." I looked down at the shattered glass on the floor, then back up to his horrified face. "And it takes less than 60 minutes to brief my international counterparts on a $50 million fraud." The shattered crystal at Julian's feet was the only sound in the foyer. The 3 finance ministers stood flanking me, presenting an impenetrable wall of global authority. The director of economic crimes moved silently to secure the perimeter. I did not waste another glance on Julian or Beatrice. I walked straight past them, entering the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. The heavy doors swung open, revealing 300 of the wealthiest investors in the world, sitting at tables adorned with white orchids and silver centerpieces. They were murmuring amongst themselves, waiting for Julian Sterling to pitch the investment opportunity of a lifetime. I bypassed the reserved VIP tables and walked directly toward the main stage. The hired master of ceremonies, a minor television personality, was standing near the podium holding a wireless microphone. He looked confused by my sudden, unscripted approach. Before he could ask for my credentials, one of the federal agents stepped up and gently but firmly removed the microphone from his hand, passing it to me. I stepped up to the acrylic podium. Behind me, a massive LED screen displayed the glowing golden logo of the Sterling Real Estate Group. I tapped the microphone once. The sharp feedback noise cut through the ambient chatter, instantly silencing the ballroom. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward the stage. They expected a smooth real estate pitch. They got me. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice cold, carrying an unmistakable edge of authority that commanded the room. "Welcome to a masterclass in deception. You are invited here tonight by the Sterling family to invest in a visionary eco-city development. You were told your capital would secure a profitable, sustainable future." I paused, scanning the faces in the front row. Several prominent hedge fund managers frowned, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I am Chloe, the Special Trade Ambassador for the United Nations," I continued, "and I am here to inform you that the project you are about to fund does not exist. The dirt has not been purchased. The permits have not been filed. You are currently attending a fundraiser hosted by criminals." The ballroom erupted. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed immediately by chaotic, angry murmurs. At the back of the room near the grand doors, I saw Beatrice Sterling pushing through the crowd. She was frantic, her face flushed red with panic and fury. She lunged toward a sound technician operating the audio board in the corner. "Turn her off!" Beatrice shrieked, clawing at the soundboard. "Cut the microphone right now!" The technician raised his hand, stepping away from the controls. "I cannot, ma'am. The federal agents locked the system down. It is hardwired to the stage." Beatrice stood there, her hands hovering uselessly over the locked soundboard, realizing she had absolutely no control over the broadcast of her family's ruin. I ignored her screaming and focused on the massive LED screen behind me. I reached into my pocket and produced a small remote clicker linked to Marcus's encrypted USB drive. I pressed the button. The golden Sterling logo vanished. It was replaced by a high-resolution scan of the 50-page prenuptial agreement Julian had attempted to force upon me just days ago. I had highlighted the specific clauses requesting proxy control over government investment funds. "Let us look at the methodology of the Sterling family," I said, pointing to the screen. When they realized they could not secure legitimate capital, they attempted to extort a federal diplomat. They demanded control of a $5 billion United Nations portfolio to bail out their failing domestic ventures. When I refused, they orchestrated a media smear campaign to discredit my authority. I clicked the remote again. The screen shifted. The prenuptial agreement disappeared, replaced by a complex, undeniable web of financial data. It was the black ledger Marcus had extracted. Columns of offshore routing numbers, dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands, and wire transfer logs filled the screen. "But their corruption does not end with extortion," I announced, projecting my voice over the rising din of the crowd. This is the Horizon Trust, a pension fund belonging to municipal workers, teachers, and transit operators. Richard Sterling convinced them to invest their life savings. He then drained that fund to pay off his own offshore debts. The Sterling Real Estate Group is not a development firm. It is a Ponzi scheme. The murmurs in the ballroom escalated into shouting. A prominent venture capitalist from Silicon Valley stood up, slamming his napkin onto the table. "We wired $10 million to the escrow account this morning," he yelled toward the back of the room where Julian was currently hiding. "Where is our money?" I held up my hand, signaling for quiet. "Your money has not moved," I assured the angry investor. "At 6 o'clock this evening, under my diplomatic authority, the international payment gateways were frozen. The $50 million the Sterlings expected to steal from you tonight has been blocked at the source. Your capital is safe. The Sterlings, however, are not." The realization of how close they had come to losing millions hit the investors like a physical blow. The anger in the room shifted entirely toward the Sterling family. I watched the elite socialites the women Beatrice played tennis with, the men who golfed with Richard, physically recoil. They scooted their chairs away from the Sterling reserve tables. In high society, poverty is a sin, but public fraud is an unforgivable contagion. They treated Beatrice like she was carrying a plague. Julian suddenly burst through the crowd near the stage. His carefully maintained composure was completely gone. He was sweating, his eyes wild and desperate. He scrambled onto the stage and lunged toward the backup microphone resting on a nearby stand. He grabbed it, his hands shaking violently. "Do not listen to her!" Julian yelled into the microphone, his voice cracking with hysteria. His words bounced off the walls, desperate and shrill. "She is lying. The data is fake. She is a vindictive, unstable woman. She is just trying to destroy us because I canceled the wedding." He pointed a shaking finger at me, turning to face the crowd. "She is sleeping with my brother-in-law. She conspired with Marcus to forge these documents because they are having an affair. She is a fraud. We are the victims here." He was throwing out the very lies he had threatened to use in the Brooklyn Cafe. He was clinging to the hope that a scandalous accusation of infidelity would distract the investors from the overwhelming evidence of financial ruin displayed on the 50-foot screen behind us. He expected the crowd to gasp at the scandal, to doubt my integrity, to give him a momentary lifeline. But before the crowd could even process Julian's frantic accusations, a movement near the front of the stage caught my attention. A figure was walking slowly and deliberately up the side stairs. The person stepping into the spotlight was not a federal agent, nor was it Marcus. It was someone Julian had never expected to see again, let alone at the most critical moment of his life. And what they held in their hands was going to shatter his final desperate illusion. Julian scrambled to pull his smartphone from his pocket. He tapped the screen frantically, trying to cast the illicit photograph of Marcus and me to the secondary monitors positioned around the ballroom. He was desperate to pivot the narrative to a cheap scandal. He wanted to be the victim of a salacious affair. He never got the chance to press the cast button. A woman wearing a vibrant crimson dress stepped out of the shadows near the front row of VIP tables. She did not rush. She walked up the short set of stairs to the stage with the methodical, unhurried pace of someone who was entirely in control. The click of her heels against the wooden stage drew the attention of the 300 guests. Julian looked up from his phone. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. It was Sophia. She was Julian's executive assistant at Sterling Real Estate Group. For the past 2 years, Sophia had managed his schedule, handled his personal expenses, and organized his most confidential meetings. She was the one person Julian trusted implicitly with the mundane details of his fraudulent life. Sophia walked directly up to Julian. She did not flinch when he instinctively took a step backward. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a thick stack of printed documents. Without a word of preamble, she threw the papers directly at his chest. The heavy stack hit him with a satisfying thud, scattering dozens of pages across the polished stage floor. "You want to talk about infidelity?" Julian Sophia asked, stepping up to the microphone he was clutching. Her voice echoed through the massive ballroom, sharp and unyielding. "You want to stand here and accuse other people of sleeping around to destroy your family?" Julian opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He was trapped in the glare of the spotlight, staring at his assistant, as if she were a ghost. "Let us talk about the apartment on the Upper East Side." Sophia continued gesturing to the papers littering the floor. "The one you leased under a shell company name. Let us talk about the $150,000 you stole from your shared wedding fund yesterday. You did not just wire it to the Cayman Islands to pay off your father's debt. You wired $50,000 of it to a private trust in my name." The ballroom fell dead silent. The investors who moments ago were outraged by financial fraud were now captivated by the sudden, brutal implosion of Julian's personal life. Sophia placed a hand flat against her stomach. Her crimson dress highlighted the subtle, undeniable curve of her waistline. "And let us talk about the 3-month-old pregnancy you have been paying me to keep quiet," she announced. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. In the front row, Vivian Sterling stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor. She stared at her brother, her eyes wide with horror and disbelief. Vivian had spent the morning physically attacking her husband Marcus, based on Julian's fabricated lie. She had slapped him in a coffee shop, fully believing Julian was the aggrieved party. Now, standing in front of 300 witnesses, she realized her brother was the actual adulterer. Julian Vivian whispered the betrayal, fracturing her voice. "You lied to me." Julian dropped the microphone. It hit the stage with a loud electronic screech that made several guests wince. He raised his hands defensively, backing away from Sophia. "Sophia, please," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. "You are confused. We can talk about this in private. We are done talking in private," Sophia replied coldly. But the destruction of Julian Sterling was not quite complete. Sophia turned away from the trembling man and looked across the stage at me. The anger on her face dissolved into a crisp, professional neutrality. She gave me a brief, subtle nod. I returned the nod. I stepped up to the acrylic podium, reclaiming the primary microphone. "Sophia is not just Julian's executive assistant," I informed the stunned crowd. "Sophia is a senior forensic auditor employed by the United Nations Office of Internal Oversight Services." Julian froze. His knees buckled slightly. He stared at Sophia, then at me, as the true magnitude of the deception crashed down upon him. "I placed her inside the Sterling Real Estate Group 6 months ago." I continued, my voice steady and unrelenting. "Long before I discovered the extent of the familial cruelty, I recognized the red flags in Richard Sterling's financial disclosures. I needed a verified operative on the inside to map the flow of the embezzled pension funds." Sophia gathered the data that Marcus later extracted. She provided the routing numbers that allowed me to freeze the international gateways tonight. Julian collapsed to his knees on the stage. The arrogant, wealthy heir who had demanded I eat plain pasta, who had threatened to ruin my career with deep-fake pornography, was now sobbing openly in front of the global elite. He had been completely outmaneuvered by the 2 women he thought he could manipulate and discard. At the back of the ballroom, the scene descended into further chaos. Beatrice Sterling, watching her son's utter humiliation and the systematic exposure of her family's crimes, decided to employ her final desperate tactic. She let out a dramatic, piercing wail. She clutched her chest with both hands, her diamond jewelry sparkling as she swayed dramatically before collapsing onto the carpeted floor. Richard Sterling rushed to his wife's side, shouting for someone to call an ambulance. Several guests backed away, giving the fallen matriarch space. It was a classic diversion. Beatrice hoped a medical emergency would halt the presentation and allow them to escape the ballroom under the guise of a health crisis. A man in a sharp tuxedo stepped out from the crowd and knelt beside Beatrice. He did not look panicked. He reached out and placed 2 fingers firmly against the side of her neck, checking her carotid artery. The man looked up at Richard, then stood back up, adjusting his cuffs. He spoke loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I am the Chief Medical Officer for the Armed Forces deployed with the diplomatic detail," he stated smoothly. "The patient's pulse is perfectly stable. Her respiration is normal. She is faking it." A ripple of disgusted laughter moved through the crowd. Beatrice, realizing her theatrical fainting spell had failed, spectacularly opened her eyes. She scrambled to a sitting position, her carefully styled hair now a tangled mess. She looked around at the faces of the people she had spent decades trying to impress. There was no pity. There was only contempt. The doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a heavy, definitive thud. The time for social embarrassment had ended. The time for legal consequence had arrived. 12 federal agents entered the room, moving with synchronized tactical precision. They wore dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters across the back. FBI. They did not pause to mingle. They marched straight past the staring guests, heading directly for Richard Sterling, who was still kneeling next to his disgraced wife on the floor. Richard Sterling, the lead agent, announced, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for securities fraud, federal embezzlement, and money laundering." The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the grand ballroom signaled the official end of the Sterling real estate dynasty. Richard Sterling did not fight back. The arrogance that had fueled his decades-long Ponzi scheme evaporated the moment the cold steel locked around his wrists. He slumped forward, a defeated graying man, allowing the federal agents to haul him to his feet. The facade of the untouchable Manhattan tycoon shattered, leaving behind nothing but a common thief. Beatrice, however, refused to surrender quietly. As two agents approached to escort her away, she scrambled to her feet, her heels slipping on the carpet. She lashed out, slapping at the arms of the approaching officers. "Get your hands off me!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. "We are the Sterlings. You cannot do this. We have friends in the mayor's office. We will have your badges for this outrage." The lead agent remained entirely unfazed by her outburst. He stepped forward and firmly grasped her wrist, securing it behind her back. "Ma'am, you are being detained under suspicion of accessory to wire fraud and conspiracy to commit extortion," he stated, his tone devoid of any emotion. Another agent holding a clipboard containing a federal seizure manifest approached Beatrice. He pointed directly at the heavy, sparkling necklace resting against her collarbone. "Remove the jewelry, ma'am," the agent instructed. Beatrice gasped, her free hand flying up to clutch the diamonds. "You cannot take this. It is a family heirloom. It belonged to my grandmother." The agent checked his clipboard, running a pen down the list of targeted assets. The receipt of purchase traces back to a Cayman Islands holding account funded by the Horizon Pension Trust. It was purchased 3 months ago with stolen funds. It is considered evidence of money laundering. Take it off, or we will remove it for you. The sheer humiliation of the moment paralyzed Beatrice. The high society matron who had spent the entire evening looking down upon the world was forced to stand in front of 300 elite guests and unfasten her own stolen jewelry. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled with the clasp. The necklace dropped into a clear plastic evidence bag held open by the federal agent. Without the diamonds, Beatrice looked remarkably small. The illusion of her superiority was entirely dependent on the wealth she had stolen from vulnerable people. Near the front of the stage, Vivian Sterling watched her parents being processed like common criminals. Panic seized her features. She realized that the protective bubble of her family's wealth had violently burst. She spun around, her eyes darting through the crowd until she located her husband. Marcus stood near the side exit, observing the systematic dismantling of his in-laws with quiet detachment. Vivian rushed toward him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the floor. She reached out, grabbing the lapels of his tailored suit, her previous hostility entirely replaced by desperate pleading. "Marcus, you have to help them." Vivian cried, tears streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. "You are a senior partner. You know the judges. Call your firm. Get them out on bail. We need to freeze their assets before the feds seize everything." Marcus did not flinch. He did not step away, nor did he offer a comforting embrace. He simply looked down at the woman who had slapped him in a Brooklyn cafe just hours prior, fully believing the lies of her corrupt brother. "I am not calling anyone Vivian," Marcus replied, his voice calm and resonant. "I am the one who provided the Federal Bureau with the routing numbers." I handed over the ledger. "Your father used my reputation to steal from my community. He used my name to harvest the retirement funds of people I grew up with." Vivian stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as the reality of his betrayal settled in. "You turned them in," she whispered, horrified. "We are your family, Marcus. How could you do this to us?" Marcus reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He did not pull out a phone to call a bail bondsman. He withdrew a folded piece of heavy legal-grade paper. He held it out to her. "You stopped being my family the day I realized I was just an accessory to your crimes," Marcus stated. Vivian hesitated before taking the paper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the document. It was a formal petition for divorce, already filed and stamped by the New York State Supreme Court. "We had a prenuptial agreement," Vivian said, her voice rising in a panicked crescendo. "You cannot touch my family's money. My mother made sure of it before we got married. She protected our assets." Marcus offered a tight, humorless smile. He adjusted his cuffs, embodying the precision of a top-tier corporate litigator. "Your mother drafted a highly restrictive prenuptial agreement designed to ensure I walked away with nothing if the marriage failed. She insisted on airtight clauses protecting all Sterling assets from marital division." He leaned in slightly, ensuring Vivian heard every word clearly. "The beauty of a restrictive prenup, Vivian, is that it works both ways. It legally severed my personal finances from the Sterling estate, which means when the federal government seizes your family's accounts, liquidates your properties, and auctions off your trust funds to repay the defrauded pensioners, my law firm partnership and my personal savings remain entirely untouched." Vivian's eyes widened as the devastating legal reality crashed down upon her. "You signed away any claim to my income 5 years ago," Marcus concluded softly. "You protected your stolen wealth so fiercely that you legally isolated yourself from the only clean money left in this family. You are walking out of this marriage with exactly what the contract stipulated: nothing." Vivian crumpled. Her legs gave out and she sank onto a nearby velvet chair, burying her face in her hands. She wept loudly, a harsh grating sound that drew no sympathy from the surrounding crowd. The family that had sneered at the concept of cheap meals and modest living was now destitute, facing decades of federal prosecution. I stood on the stage watching the social hierarchy of the room rapidly adjust to the new reality. The elite investors, the sovereign wealth managers, and the high-profile politicians did not offer comfort to the Sterlings. They did not intervene. They physically distanced themselves, forming a wide perimeter around the disgraced family. In the ruthless ecosystem of Manhattan high society, proximity to failure is a fatal flaw. The Sterlings were no longer influential players. They were toxic liabilities. The same socialites who had eagerly accepted Beatrice's invitations yesterday were now quietly deleting her number from their phones. The investors who had almost signed away $50 million were instructing their aides to sever all communication channels with Sterling Real Estate Group. The Federal Bureau of Economic Crimes finished securing Richard and Beatrice. They led the handcuffed couple toward the main exit of the ballroom. Julian remained kneeling on the stage, weeping quietly into his hands, entirely broken by the revelation of Sophia's true identity and his impending arrest. The silence in the grand ballroom was profound. It was not the silence of respect or awe. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an empire collapsing into dust. I stepped down from the podium. My role in the public execution was complete. The federal agents would handle the legal dismantling of the Sterling assets, and the media would handle the social crucifixion. I had reclaimed my diplomatic authority, protected $50 million of foreign capital, and ensured the Horizon Pension Trust would be fully refunded. I walked past the shivering form of Julian Sterling. I did not offer him a parting insult or a triumphant smirk. He was no longer a threat. He was a footnote in a federal indictment. I reached the bottom of the stage stairs and headed toward the side exit, escorted by my security detail. The night was over, but the final pathetic attempt at manipulation was still waiting for me in the cold air of the parking garage. The heavy service doors of the Waldorf Astoria closed behind me, cutting off the chaotic aftermath of the ruined Gala. The loading dock and underground parking garage were stark illuminated by the harsh glare of fluorescent security lights. The air smelled of damp concrete and vehicle exhaust. It was a severe contrast to the opulent crystal-lit ballroom I had just dismantled. The transition from high society glamour to the stark reality of federal detention was swift and unforgiving. My security detail, led by Agent Davis, maintained a tight perimeter as we walked toward the idling armored SUV. The diplomatic plates gleamed in the dim light. Further down the ramp, 3 dark blue federal transport vans were parked with their rear doors open, waiting to process the Sterling family. Richard Sterling was already secured inside the first van, his head bowed, defeated by the weight of a multi-million-dollar federal indictment. Beatrice was being loaded into the second van, arguing futilely with a stoic female agent regarding the confiscation of her designer handbag. As we approached my vehicle, a sudden commotion erupted near the third transport van. "Chloe, wait. Please, Chloe." The frantic, desperate scream echoed off the concrete walls. 2 federal agents were attempting to guide Julian Sterling toward the back of the transport van. Julian, stripped of his custom tuxedo jacket and restricted by heavy steel handcuffs, fought against their grip with frantic, panicked energy. He dug the heels of his polished leather shoes into the concrete, refusing to move forward. The polished, arrogant heir who had demanded a government bailout over a plate of pasta was entirely gone. He resembled a frightened animal caught in a trap of his own design. He wrenched his shoulder forcefully, breaking the hold of the agent on his left for a fraction of a second. It was enough time for him to stumble toward my security perimeter. He did not get far. Agent Davis intercepted him instantly, placing a firm, unyielding hand squarely in the center of Julian's chest, stopping his forward momentum cold. The 2 escorting agents quickly recovered and secured his arms again, preparing to physically haul him toward the van. "Wait!" Julian sobbed, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "Let me speak to her. Just 5 seconds. Please." I paused near the open door of my SUV. I raised a hand, signaling my detail to hold their positions, but allow him to speak. I wanted to hear the final, desperate negotiation of a man who realized he had lost every single piece of leverage. Julian fell to his knees on the cold, oil-stained concrete. The sharp impact tore the fabric of his expensive tuxedo trousers. He did not care. He craned his neck to look up at me, tears streaming freely down his face, mixing with the sweat on his forehead. "I am so sorry, Chloe." Julian wept, his voice ragged and breathless. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. My father forced me into the scheme. He told me the company would go under if I did not secure the foreign capital. My mother pressured me to play the role at the restaurant. They manipulated me. I never wanted to hurt you." The sheer cowardice of the excuse was staggering. Even in the face of absolute ruin, Julian refused to take responsibility for his own malice. He attempted to offload his guilt onto the very parents who were currently being loaded into federal vans a few yards away. He was trying to rewrite the narrative one last time, casting himself as the tragic victim of familial expectation rather than the willing architect of extortion and blackmail. "Please, Chloe," he begged, struggling uselessly against the cuffs. "We lived together for 2 years. We loved each other. You know I am a good person deep down. You have diplomatic immunity. You have federal authority. You can talk to the prosecutors. You can tell them I was coerced. You can save me from this." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead toward the dirty concrete in a gesture of absolute pathetic submission. "I will do anything," Julian promised, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "I will sign whatever you want. I will testify against my father. I will give you the rest of the offshore accounts. Just get me out of these cuffs, please. I will be your servant. I will be the help for the rest of my life. Just save me." The phrase hung in the cold air of the parking garage. "I will be the help." He had unconsciously invoked the exact insult his mother had used to humiliate me at Le Bernardin, the insult he had silently endorsed while sipping Cabernet. He believed that offering himself as a subservient pawn would somehow appeal to a desire for vengeance. He assumed I operated on the same toxic hierarchical principles that governed his family. The entire parking garage seemed to hold its breath. The federal agents stood silently, their faces impassive, waiting for my directive. The idling engines of the transport vans provided a low, steady hum. I looked down at Julian. I did not feel a surge of triumphant satisfaction. I did not feel a sudden wave of pity for the sobbing man at my feet. I felt a profound, chilling emptiness. I was looking at a hollow shell of a human being, a man whose entire identity was constructed upon wealth he did not earn and power he stole. Stripped of his money and his status, there was nothing left but a coward begging for mercy from the woman he had tried to destroy. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance until I stood directly over him. "You misunderstand the nature of power," Julian said. My voice was quiet, steady, and devoid of any emotional inflection. Julian looked up, his bloodshot eyes wide with a desperate, clinging hope. He thought my proximity meant a reprieve. "You believe power is the ability to force people into submission." I continued, my gaze fixed on his terrified face. "You believe it is the authority to demand the cheapest meal for someone you deem inferior. You believe it is the leverage to extort a government signature with a digital threat." I tilted my head slightly, studying the tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. But true power, Julian, is the ability to walk away from a ruined empire and feel absolutely nothing, I stated. The desperate hope in Julian's eyes extinguished instantly. He realized the begging had failed. The manipulation was useless. He was facing a wall of solid ice. "Take him away," I instructed the federal agents, my voice echoing sharply in the concrete cavern. The agents hauled Julian to his feet roughly. He did not fight back this time. The fight had been entirely drained out of him. He let out a long, hollow wail, a sound devoid of words as they dragged him toward the open doors of the federal transport van. They pushed him inside and slammed the heavy steel doors shut, sealing him into his new reality. I turned my back on the departing vans and stepped into the plush, quiet interior of my armored SUV. Agent Davis closed the door, sealing away the noise of the garage. The convoy of federal vehicles began to roll out of the loading dock, their red and blue lights flashing silently against the concrete walls. I watched them go from the tinted window. The Sterling family was heading toward processing arraignment and eventually decades in federal prison. The empire they had built on the backs of vulnerable pensioners and stolen capital was officially dismantled. The driver shifted the SUV into gear and pulled smoothly onto the bustling streets of Manhattan. The city lights blurred past the window in vibrant streaks of yellow and white. I reached into my bag and pulled out my secure government phone. The screen displayed a notification from the United Nations General Assembly. My diplomatic suspension was fully lifted. My access to the global grid was restored. I had a treaty to finalize with the Japanese delegation by morning and a $5 billion foreign direct investment fund to allocate to legitimate sustainable infrastructure projects. The game was over. The garbage had been taken out. It was time to get back to work. I leaned forward just an inch. The damp concrete soaked through the knees of his tailored trousers. He looked up at me, waiting for salvation. "You are wrong, Julian," I said. My voice was even sharp as a razor carving a final line between us. The help actually work with their own hands. They produce value. They have dignity. You are just a parasite wearing an expensive suit. I turned my back on him. I did not watch his reaction. I stepped up into the dark interior of the black armored SUV. The heavy reinforced door slammed shut. The thick ballistic glass muted his frantic screaming into a dull, distant hum. I stared straight ahead. I did not look out the window. I did not watch the federal agents drag him into the transport van. The Sterling family ceased to exist in my reality the moment that door secured. Setting a boundary is not a negotiation. It is a locked gate. Julian had assumed my silence during our relationship was a sign of weakness. He mistook restraint for compliance. The drive back through the city streets felt different tonight. The oppressive weight of his family and their endless, exhausting demands had evaporated. I opened my civilian phone one last time. I accessed the digital photo albums, the contact lists, the shared calendar invites. I deleted every file. I did not archive the memories. I eradicated them. A parasite requires a host to survive, and I was shutting down the host system. Dawn broke over the Manhattan skyline, casting a pale, clean light through the windows of my secure suite. I stood at the kitchen island, holding a mug of black coffee. A federal courier had delivered the morning editions of the major financial publications. I spread the newspapers across the marble counter. The collapse of the Sterling Empire dominated every front page. The Wall Street Journal ran a harsh clinical breakdown of the fraud. Sterling Real Estate Group implodes amid federal raid. The article detailed the staggering scope of Richard Sterling and his offshore accounts. It described the chaotic scene at the Waldorf Astoria, painting a vivid picture of wealthy investors fleeing the ballroom as the authorities stormed the stage, the New York Post. The very tabloid Beatrice had attempted to weaponize against me featured a full-page photograph of her being escorted into a federal vehicle. Her diamond necklace was notably absent. Her face was contorted in a mask of sheer panic. I read through the columns of text, scanning the paragraphs for a specific detail. I checked the financial blogs, the evening news transcripts, and the social media trending topics. The narrative was uniform. A rogue executive assistant named Sophia had blown the whistle. An anonymous international regulatory agency had frozen the capital. A sharp-eyed corporate lawyer named Marcus had provided the digital ledger. My name was nowhere to be found. There was no mention of the special trade ambassador. There were no photographs of my black evening gown. The press did not know about the extortion attempt at the Italian restaurant or the frozen joint checking account. The United Nations Diplomatic Corps possesses the infrastructure to scrub an identity from a public scandal. They had invoked a federal gag order on my involvement to protect the integrity of the Foreign Direct Investment Fund. To the public eye, the Sterlings had simply buckled under the weight of their own greed. This is the stark difference between generational wealth and actual authority. Beatrice had spent her entire life chasing the spotlight. She believed that power was a front-row seat at a charity gala, a designer label, a loud rumor spread across a country club dining room. Julian believed power was threatening a woman with deep-fake photos and throwing temper tantrums in Brooklyn coffee shops. They thrived on noise. They relied on spectacle to intimidate their targets. True power does not need to broadcast its victories on a live stream. It does not require a press conference or an audience of sycophants. Real influence operates in the shadows. It maneuvers quietly, shifting the tectonic plates of global finance without ever leaving a fingerprint. It destroys those who dare to cross its boundaries, and it does so with terrifying silence. The morning news cycle was relentless. By 9 o'clock, the financial networks were running continuous coverage of the arrests. Pundits dissected the anatomy of the Ponzi scheme. Analysts traced the flow of stolen capital from the Horizon Pension Trust to the Cayman Islands. They interviewed defrauded contractors and shocked country club acquaintances. Everyone who had ever shaken Richard Sterling by the hand was now desperately scrambling to disavow him. I watched a brief segment on a daytime news channel. The reporters showed a clip sourced from social media. It was Vivian. She was standing on the sidewalk outside her luxury condominium, surrounded by frantic movers, packing her belongings into cardboard boxes. Marcus had enforced the prenuptial agreement with brutal efficiency. Vivian was stripped of her assets. Her credit cards declined, her social standing reduced to ash. She screamed at the paparazzi recording her eviction, demanding they stop filming. Just a day prior, she had weaponized a live broadcast to destroy my reputation. Now she was begging the cameras to leave her alone. The irony was poetic, but I felt no satisfaction watching her downfall. I simply turned off the television. The psychological detachment I experienced was profound. When a tumor is surgically removed from the body, the patient does not mourn the loss of the diseased tissue. They simply heal the incision and continue living. The Sterlings were a social malignancy. They preyed on the vulnerable, exploited the honest, and devoured anyone who did not fit their narrow, bigoted view of the world. They had attempted to consume me. They had expected me to fold under the pressure of their collective malice. Instead, they broke their teeth on solid iron. I sat at my desk and opened my secure laptop. The global grid was alive. Markets were opening across Europe and Asia. The $50 million of foreign capital I had blocked at the gateway had been safely rerouted back to the sovereign wealth funds. My inbox was filled with encrypted messages from foreign delegates expressing their continued confidence in the United Nations trade initiatives. They did not know the specifics of the Waldorf Astoria intervention, but they understood that their assets were secure under my watch. My staff was already preparing the briefing materials for the afternoon. A treaty negotiation with the Japanese Trade Ministry required my immediate attention. The world did not stop spinning because a Manhattan real estate family imploded. The global economy marched forward, indifferent to the tears of Julian Sterling or the fake fainting spells of his mother. I smoothed the lapel of my blazer. The dark bruises on my wrist from Julian grabbing me at the restaurant were still visible, a fading physical reminder of the chaos I had navigated. But the pain was gone. The emotional toll they had tried to exact had been neutralized by the clinical execution of justice. I had set a boundary made of titanium reinforced by federal law and diplomatic immunity. The Sterlings had tried to breach that boundary. They had tried to call me the help. They had tried to treat me like collateral damage. Now they were federal inmates facing decades behind bars, and I was preparing to allocate billions of dollars in sustainable infrastructure grants. I picked up my pen. I had a schedule to keep. The silence in my office was not empty. It was the sound of undisputed authority, the kind of authority that never needs to raise its voice to command the room. Exactly 1 month has passed since the heavy steel doors of the federal transport vans slammed shut in the subterranean parking garage of the Waldorf Astoria. The transition from the suffocating, chaotic atmosphere of Manhattan high society to the crisp, unyielding clarity of my current environment has been absolute. I am currently sitting at a vast oak desk inside a newly assigned executive office in Geneva. Through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, I have an unobstructed view of the distant snow-capped peaks of the Alps and the deep, freezing gray waters of Lake Geneva. The air here feels entirely different. It is sharp, clean, and devoid of the toxic, desperate posturing that defined every single interaction with the Sterling family. I lift a white porcelain mug and take a slow, deliberate sip of black coffee. The bitter, grounding taste anchors me to the present moment. My diplomatic portfolio has expanded significantly in the wake of the aborted financial fraud. Foreign delegates who witnessed the swift clinical execution of the international asset freeze now operate with a renewed sense of profound respect when they enter my boardroom. The global trade initiatives are moving forward seamlessly. The disruption caused by a few greedy real estate heirs feels like a distant, irrelevant footnote in a much larger geopolitical timeline. The encrypted terminal on my desk chimes with a soft, unobtrusive alert. A secure email has bypassed the standard international filters. I check the sender identification. It is from Marcus. I set my coffee mug down and open the message. The tone of his writing is entirely transformed. The heavy, exhausted resignation of a man trapped in a manipulative marriage is completely gone. He writes with the crisp, energized focus of a man who has finally reclaimed his own life. Marcus informs me that he officially resigned from the prestigious corporate law firm that the Sterlings had used to leverage his career. He has opened his own independent legal practice in a modest brick building in Brooklyn. He is no longer defending wealthy developers who exploit zoning laws. Instead, he is taking the formidable litigation skills he honed in elite courtrooms and weaponizing them on behalf of the vulnerable. His new firm specializes in providing aggressive legal defense for small minority-owned businesses facing predatory eviction tactics. Furthermore, Marcus shares a critical update regarding the Horizon Pension Trust. The federal government successfully routed the embezzled millions back to the municipal workers and teachers. Marcus is acting as their pro bono legal counsel, ensuring the distribution of the recovered capital is flawless and that not a single cent is lost to bureaucratic fees. He found his true purpose. He shed the parasitic weight of Vivian and the Sterling name, and he is building a legacy rooted in actual justice. The second half of his email details the ongoing fallout of the federal indictments. The justice system is notoriously slow, but the financial ruin of the Sterling dynasty was instantaneous and absolute. Julian is facing the stark reality of the American penal system without the buffer of generational wealth. The luxury penthouse he bragged about, the one he had secretly leased, using stolen wedding funds to house his pregnant assistant, went into immediate foreclosure. Federal marshals arrived at dawn, changed the locks, and seized everything inside to pay down the restitution orders. The collection of designer watches he flaunted at country clubs is currently sitting in a government auction warehouse. Julian is currently sitting in a holding cell at a high-security federal detention center, awaiting trial, without the possibility of bail. The prosecution deemed him an extreme flight risk. Because all familial assets are frozen under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, Julian cannot afford a private defense attorney. The man who thought he could extort a United Nations ambassador is now relying on an overworked public defender. He traded his custom-tailored Italian suits for an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. He is learning the hard way that arrogance holds zero currency in front of a federal judge. But the most striking piece of information in the email pertains to Beatrice. The court seized every bank account, every investment portfolio, and every piece of real estate attached to her name. They confiscated her luxury vehicles and auctioned off her jewelry collection to compensate the defrauded investors. To cover her mounting court fees and basic survival expenses, Beatrice was forced to enter the manual labor market. With her reputation completely toxic, no corporate office or high-end boutique would hire her. She was forced to take a minimum wage position. Beatrice Sterling is currently working the cloakroom and performing custodial maintenance at Le Bernardin. It is the exact same 3-star Michelin restaurant where she demanded I be served the cheapest pasta on the menu. It is the exact same dining room where she looked a waiter in the eye and called me the help. Now she spends her evenings taking heavy winter coats from the wealthy socialites who used to eagerly attend her charity galas. She organizes umbrellas. She wipes down the marble sinks in the public restrooms. She is forced to stand in a drab uniform and look her former peers in the eye while handing them their belongings. The women she used to play tennis with walk past her leaving crumpled dollar bills in a tip jar. The poetic justice of her current reality is far sharper than any calculated revenge I could have engineered. She built her entire identity on looking down at the working class. Now she is trapped permanently at the very bottom of the hierarchy she worshipped. I read the final lines of the email feeling a profound, quiet sense of closure. I close the laptop screen. The soft mechanical click echoes in the serene office. I turn my chair toward the expansive windows, watching the sunlight glint off the distant mountain peaks. The events of the past month have solidified a fundamental truth in my mind, one that I will carry into every negotiation room for the rest of my life. Life will constantly present you with people who demand that you shrink yourself to fit into their narrow, suffocating cages. They will use money-fabricated status or relentless social pressure to make you feel small. They will attempt to convince you that your worth is determined by the brand of your clothing, the balance of your bank account, or your willingness to submit to their unreasonable demands. They will test your boundaries to see how much of your dignity you are willing to trade for their conditional acceptance. Do not ever shrink. Do not fold yourself into a shape that pleases weak, insecure people. The Sterlings thought they could break my spirit because I chose humility over arrogance. They mistook my quiet observation for ignorance. They believed that respect was a currency I had to beg for at their dinner table. They learned the hard way that respect is never a gift you receive from bullies. Respect is a fortress you build with iron boundaries. When someone shows you they do not value your humanity, you do not argue with them. You do not try to prove your worth. You simply lock the gate and let them starve outside your walls. I am speaking directly to you right now, the person listening to this broadcast. If you have ever been in a room where someone looked down on you because of your background, your profession, or your appearance, if you have ever sat across a table from someone who made you feel like you were not enough, if you have ever been treated like a stepping stone by people who confuse wealth with character, I want you to go down to the comments right now and type the word power. Reclaim your space. Let the world know that your value is not up for negotiation. You are the sole architect of your reality, and you do not need permission to demand basic human decency. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories about waking up, walking away, and taking back total control of your life. Stand tall. Keep your boundaries made of steel. I wish you unwavering strength in whatever battles you are facing today. Take care of yourselves. I will see you next time. The sun begins to set over the Alps, casting long, sharp shadows across my office. As the golden light fades into the cool dusk of Geneva, I find myself reflecting on the wreckage left behind in Manhattan. The Sterling family thought they were playing a game of social dominance. They did not realize they were sitting at a table where the stakes were their very freedom. Looking back at the empty threats, the fake diamond necklaces, and the shattered crystal flutes, I realized this ordeal taught me three fundamental truths about human nature and power. First, true power never has to raise its voice. Beatrice Sterling and her son Julian lived their lives at maximum volume. They used expensive restaurant bills, loud tantrums, and tabloid media to intimidate anyone they deemed inferior. They equated noise with authority. But real influence operates in the quiet spaces. It is the silent keystroke that freezes a $50 million account. It is the calm refusal to sign a fraudulent document. When you know exactly who you are and what you control, you never need to scream to command a room. Let the insecure people shout. You just keep holding the pen. Second, boundaries are not a negotiation. For 2 years, I observed Julian testing the perimeter of my self-respect. The engagement dinner was not an isolated incident. It was the final escalation. Many people make the mistake of trying to explain their boundaries to those who repeatedly violate them. They hope that if they just find the right words, the abuser will finally understand and change. The Sterlings taught me that toxic people understand perfectly well what they are doing. They just do not care. A boundary is not a discussion. It is a steel wall. When someone crosses it, you do not argue. You simply lock them out and throw away the key. Third, never shrink yourself to fit inside the fragile ego of another person. I drove a cheap car and wore modest clothing because I wanted a relationship built on authentic connection, not financial leverage. But Julian saw my modesty as a weakness to exploit. Insecure people will always demand that you make yourself smaller so they can feel larger. They will call you the help to mask their own impending bankruptcy. Never dim your light to make a predator feel comfortable in the dark. Stand in your full brilliance, even if it blinds them. You are the sole architect of your life. You decide who gets a seat at your table. If you are sitting across from someone who serves you disrespect on a silver platter, get up, pay your own bill, and walk away. If my journey resonated with you, if you are ready to reclaim your space and build your own steel boundaries, please like this video and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. I share these experiences so you can find the courage to rewrite your own narrative. Stay strong, keep your guard up, and I will see you in the next one.